Right, so the SNP have stated that they are going to bring a new ceasefire vote to the Commons, and considering where things are now compared to the last ceasefire vote they brought last November, the vast majority of the Gazan population pretty much huddled up in Rafah, cornered and with nowhere left to go, it is more critical than ever that Western leaders wake up to the consequences of this. Of course, what the last SNP ceasefire vote did do was expose the splits within Keir Starmer's Labour Party, with 10 of his MPs resigning their shadow cabinet posts and numerous other MPs voting with their consciences, and against Starmer's official line, rancid as that was. You would imagine, therefore, that news of another vote coming up would make Labour think twice about abstaining again then. The vote is coming this week. It was possibly going to be held off until the following week, since Opposition Day debates are always held on Wednesdays, and the Rochdale by-election is that Thursday. However, with Labour having been forced to pull their candidate for daring to have an honest opinion of the events leading up to October 7th, that likely lost its impact and is now definitely going to come this week. Will Starmer once more show he's on the side of Israel rather than the side of what is right and just and humane, and whip his MPs to abstain again? Well, despite the spin of the mainstream media this morning, David Lammy might have given the game away, that abstaining is exactly where Labour are going to go again. Right, so this week we're going to see another Opposition Day debate and vote on a ceasefire in Gaza, brought once more by the SNP. Functionally, they're the actual opposition in Parliament these days, since Labour might as well be sharing the Tory government benches for all the difference they make under the leadership of the MP for Zionism, Keir Starmer. Last November, Starmer's party was split down the middle on this issue, with many Labour MPs refusing to be as blatantly appalling as Starmer and his hangers-on, and voted with the SNP motion to call for a ceasefire. It was never going to pass. The Tories were always going to vote against it, and Starmer, already with a reputation for having an arse full of splinters for all his sitting on the fence, ordered the rest of his MPs to do likewise. Many didn't, including 10 then shadow cabinet ministers who quit their roles to vote with the SNP. Now, there are many and varied reasons for this in some of those cases. For some on the left, the SCG MPs, this was a matter of principle and standing up for what is right. For others, for example, like Jess Phillips, it was about the fact they have very large Muslim voter demographics in their constituencies and were terrified of losing their seats over this. And you can't have a shadow cabinet role, after all, if you aren't in Parliament. And hoping Starmer might put you at some point in the future into the Lords to get around that, well, that isn't a guarantee. Now, all of that hasn't changed. The MPs still have their Muslim constituents, but what has changed on that front is that those constituents are becoming more vocal, more active, and they're swinging behind their own candidates if needs be, and the Muslim vote movement that has sprung up to mount independent challenges or support pro-ceasefire, pro-Palestine, pro-Muslim interests, they're floating around at the back of these MPs' minds. For other Labour MPs, though, the situation hasn't changed from how they voted before. If anything, the situation is now dramatically worse, with Gazans literally starving to death, aid being blocked from getting through, and the majority of the population huddled up on the Egyptian border with Gaza, with nowhere else to go anymore as the Israeli army closes in on them. I cannot envisage those MPs who voted for a ceasefire last time to have changed their minds in light of any of this. If anything, more MPs might now join them if Starmer is determined to abstain again. I cannot under any circumstances see that Brill-creamed Burke, the political equivalent of a week full of Monday mornings, deviating in any way from his unequivocal support for the Zionist regime of Israel, his obeisance to it. It is absolute. But that's not to say the mainstream media are not spinning like mad this morning to try and imply that Starmer might be considering it. The BBC on their website have highlighted a David Lammy interview this morning, headlined with "Labour considers backing SNP ceasefire motion." And this solely comes to rest on the fact that Lammy said, "We will consider the motion on its merits when we see it." Here's the thing though, we already know what the merits of this motion will be because it's already come out. It will call for a ceasefire. Supporting it will show intent, show the public how our politicians feel about the situation in Gaza. Supporting it won't actually bring about a ceasefire. That would obviously take international consensus. It would take Genocide Joe pulling his head out of his backside. But it will show shifting political direction. If Labour voted with the SNP, they would show they back a ceasefire. They back holding Israel to the findings of the ICJ provisional orders, which functionally can only be carried out with a ceasefire. And it shows that as the UK finds itself being taken to The Hague for aiding and abetting with Israel in its plausible case for genocide by continuing to supply weapons to the regime by both South Africa and Nicaragua as things stand right now, with more possibly waiting in the wings. It is especially important to note, actually, that the ICJ court case that South Africa brought against Israel hadn't yet happened, let alone been ruled on by the ICJ at the time of the last ceasefire vote. So a plausible case for genocide, having been demonstrated at the World Court as it has, should be a massive game changer for Parliament. Is Starmer so up his own backside he thinks he knows better than the ICJ court judges on some matters? Well, yes, I think we'd all agree, absolutely. Yes, he is. He is that arrogant. But for as much as the BBC are doing the establishment's bidding, reminding us that headline that Starmer is the anointed one, saying that Labour would decide what is coming on the merits of the motion, what they omit to mention is that the SNP have already published their motion. They've published it already. And that completely rubbished David Lammy's excuses this morning. The SNP motion itself reads that this House calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel, notes with shock and distress that the death toll has now risen beyond 28,000, the vast majority of whom were women and children, further notes that there are currently 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering in Rafah, 610,000 of whom are children, also notes they have nowhere else to go, condemns any military assault on what is now the largest refugee camp in the world, further calls for the immediate release of all hostages taken by Hamas and an end to the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, and recognises that the only way to stop the slaughter of innocent civilians is to press for a ceasefire. It is completely reasonable. Not my words describing that motion, but the words of Blairite Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar, because Scottish Labour back a ceasefire and are completely out of lockstep with Starmer's position. And more I can see Starmer becoming isolated over this. But utterly reliant as he is on his pro-Israel backers both personally and for his party, I just can't see him ever budging on this. And what Lammy actually said this morning seems to make that abundantly clear. Here's what Lammy said when speaking to Laura Kuenssberg this morning from Munich, where he is at the moment with Starmer at a security conference. When asked if Labour will support this ceasefire motion this week, he said, "Well, we all want to see an end to the fighting. It must stop. Over 28,000 people have lost their lives, women and children. You know, one of my children is adopted. 17,000 orphans now in Gaza. It's abominable. So of course people want to see a ceasefire. The question now is how. And to be absolutely clear, when that ceasefire comes, we can't see the fighting restart. That's why I've been here with Keir Starmer speaking to the Saudi Arabians, the Qataris, European allies. I haven't seen the motion. It's not yet put down. We will scrutinise that motion as is our way in Parliament. That will come in Monday, I expect, Tuesday, and we will look at it from there. But look, let us be clear. Yes, we will have a vote in Parliament this week, but it's not that vote that will bring about a ceasefire. It's the diplomatic actions. It's Hamas. It's Benjamin Netanyahu. It's Partners for Peace saying the fighting must now stop. Now, if Lammy hasn't seen the motion had already been published, it's been out since Saturday, as it happens, that I've seen it, then I can't really see, as Shadow Foreign Secretary, how he or his staff were not aware of it. But it's the excuse-making he was already doing just then that imply Labour will not be supporting this vote once again. We know the vote won't bring about a ceasefire, but it shows whether you're on the side of peace or not, the side of what is right and just or not. And with that ICJ ruling having been made, those orders laid down, that plausible case has been proven, yet to be found as such on the merits, but that can take years, which are years those trapped in Rafah right now clearly do not have. To abstain this time, here and now, when Gaza has been all but razed to the ground, as another hospital, Nasser Hospital, gets rendered completely inoperable, another war crime, to sit on your hands as this has continued, has demonstrably got worse. The consequences and the message to the general public that you're going to sit on the fence in the face of genocide is not going to wash. We won't put up with it. It's going to look so much worse this time than it did last time. Lammy knows the numbers. 28,000 people dead, 17,000 orphans. Shoehorn in that you adopted a child, why don't you? Don't weaponise that poor kid. Don't weaponise that as an excuse for you failing to back a ceasefire again. Because if that is what Starmer demands, Lammy of all people will be the first in line to obey. Wednesday is going to be a big test for Labour again. And so many people all over this country are going to be watching to see how they vote, how their MP votes, if they bother at all and don't just sit on their hands, and who does or doesn't stand up and be counted for doing what is right. David Lammy will do what he's told. It's what he always does. It's how he's lasted as an MP for as long as he has. But people are becoming more aware of the machinations behind some MPs. They're not putting up with it anymore, and he's certainly discussed more than his fair share of people. But he can hardly be regarded as the most pro-Israel MP. You'd probably be hard-pressed to actually look past Starmer himself on that score. But then a brand new and shiny, newly elected MP from this week's by-elections is literally married to a former member of the Israeli Defence Force, and even converted to Judaism upon visiting Israel and beginning a relationship with his now husband. And you can find out all about that on this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so it seems when Labour come under threat from an up-and-coming parliamentary candidate or candidates, instead of promoting their own policy, for some in the Labour Party now, a party that claims to have cleaned its act up under Keir Starmer, as laughable as that has proven to be, the answer is to throw insults apparently, make personal slights and generally be as low down, dirty and despicable in their very public and personal conduct as they can be. A number of independent candidates have sprung up to challenge some key Labour figures, and for one has-been old Zionist in particular, they seem to have taken it upon themselves to not only bring the Labour Party into disrepute, exposing how deeply unpleasant and offensive some permitted to remain in Starmer's Labour are, but also how empty and bereft of ideas they are too. That this is the conduct that they resort to instead of offering something transformative that appeals to voters instead. It treats the voting public with disrespect to behave like this, not just opposition candidates. Right, so Damo, don't play coy with us, please. Who is this obscene individual making a prat of themselves with personal attacks on independent candidates, having the temerity to challenge Labour and not just give them a free pass to power? Well, don't let me keep you on the edge of your seat and in suspense for a moment longer, for it is the former MP for Ilford South, Milky Mike Gapes. Now, if you don't know about Mike Gapes and his fascination with milk, which spawned a whole Twitter parody called @MilkGapes, goes by the name of the Foundation for Mike Gapes Research, it came down to a bizarre late-night speech in 2017, where Gapes' biggest concern over Brexit was a hard border between the Republic of and Northern Ireland, which would threaten the free-roaming cattle and thereby threaten the production of Bailey's Irish Cream. That's pretty much the highlight of Gapes' parliamentary career. It has stuck. Milk memes still follow him around to this day, together than being a besotted Labour friend of Israel and an ardent Zionist as well. But even more well known, probably than anything he did as an MP, was how he put himself out of a job by defecting from Labour and being a founding member of the thankfully short-lived political embarrassment that was Change UK, also known as the Funny Tinge Party, with a number of other right-wing has-beens that nobody misses either. Gapes hated Corbyn, really hated Corbyn, hated anything resembling change, really, so defecting to Change UK was a hilarious example of irony because they represented nothing of the sort, and for him at least, the anti-Semitism crisis under Corbyn, the scam that it was his excuse to leave. He's now since rejoined Labour as a member. Anti-Semitism and all other forms of racism we know are not being dealt with and handled properly, but that was never what it was really about. Gapes is a right-winger, and Labour stopped being right-wing for a short while, and now it's back to being as awful as it ever was before. So is Gapes, to prove that point, it seems. But if the conduct of Gapes, as it is demonstrably being shown for all to see, was done by a lefty and was aimed at any member of the Jewish community, then the governance and legal unit would have them suspended, I fancy, before they could literally say anti-Semitism. Being the MP for Ilford South since 1992, so it was quite remarkable that he lasted until 2019 and we have so little to say about him in his parliamentary professionalism. He lost his seat in 2019 to Sam Tarry, to Labour, as he was standing for Funny Tinge in that election, although Gapes did attempt to confuse voters on that by imitating Labour's colours and showing how little actual integrity and how little courage he actually had to stand on his own record. 1 pint or 2, mate. But he obviously had that relationship with the MP for Ilford North too, which since 2015 had been Starmer's health minion Wes Streeting. Now, Streeting, as regular viewers will know, is being challenged over his staunch Zionist views, his support for Israel, his refusal to back a ceasefire, in total lockstep with Keir Starmer all the way up until now. Local members in Ilford North opposed to Streeting's apparent indifference to the genocide in Gaza and refusing to back a ceasefire got together, the Redbridge Community Action Group, and they selected to stand against Wes Streeting, a brilliant young woman, a British Palestinian called Leanne Mohammed. It's really put the cat amongst the pigeons. Streeting only has a majority of around 5,000, about half that of the Rochdale constituency, for example, which we're looking at a by-election towards, which Labour have looked certain to lose even before they pulled their candidate out from that election. But Streeting has an even larger Muslim presence in his constituency, causing him an additional headache, and with an opponent like Leanne Mohammed, that's rapidly becoming a skull-splitting migraine. He was speaking to Kay Burley this morning in relation to protests outside Tory MP Tobias Ellwood's home, protesting for Palestine, and related that to those Redbridge organised protests outside of his own constituency office that I've covered in previous videos, saying he didn't agree with them, and that they've all been a little bit hard on him. Should we have a collective for poor Wesley? Imagine how the people in Gaza must feel in comparison to Wesley's slighted and his bruised ego and his bruised conscience, and feeling so sorry for himself because they're only being blown to bits or dying of hunger or disease instead, aren't they? But hey, Wesley, you got protested at a weekend outside your offices when neither you nor your staff were there, and you're whinging on national TV. Get over yourself. It was a demonstration. It got the media's attention. It was a warning shot to you that your constituents aren't happy with you. But don't you go changing now, eh, Wes? Well, anyway, Leanne and the Redbridge Community Group have become a target for gapes. How dare these people stand up for Gaza, stand up for Palestine, and stand against Labour? On Saturday, you might have been there. If not, you might well be aware of it. But there was a bit of a protest going on in London. The latest pro-Palestine demonstration, which rocked up outside the Israeli embassy, and amongst the speakers addressing some 250,000 people who joined that latest march, they do keep getting bigger and bigger, don't they, was Leanne Mohammed herself, who addressed the crowd, spoke brilliantly, led the crowd in a chant of no ceasefire, no vote, spoke of punishing both the Labour Party and the Tories, to tell them that we won't put up with arms sales and diplomatic cover for ethnic cleansing, and there can be no forgiveness for those who wouldn't vote for a ceasefire last time, as we look ahead to the next SNP ceasefire vote later this week. Well, Redbridge Community Action Group, as you might have expected, being her main supporters at the moment, tweeted out that Leanne's they tweeted out the whole of Leanne's full 5-minute address, in fact, to the crowd, saying, "The independent PPC for Ilford North, Leanne Mohammed, speaks truth to power outside the Israeli embassy in London. Over 250,000 people gathered to hear Leanne speak. No ceasefire, no vote. Labour have given cover to the Tories and Biden in their support of the genocide in Gaza." Well, absolutely they have. But Mike Gapes, well, he didn't like this at all. And in reply to this video that they tweeted out, he tweeted, "All those complicit, where was condemnation of the Hamas terrorists who started this? I didn't hear it. The people of Ilford North of all faiths, whether Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Sikh or none, will never vote for a divisive Hamas apologist. We reject extremism." So Leanne Mohammed, by omission, by not mentioning Hamas, is now apparently a Hamas apologist for them. Well, it isn't Hamas who are facing plausible charges of genocide right now. And as much as they did indeed go into Israel on October the 7th and take Israeli hostages, the deaths that resulted on that night, as so many in Labour love to remind us of, the largest death toll of Jewish people since the Holocaust, well, it is yet to be proven how many of those people actually died at Hamas's hands, particularly when footage exists of people being killed that night by Israeli helicopters. Multiple eyewitnesses accounts talk about Hannibal directives, Israel killing their own people to avoid being taken hostage, and of course the reason they do that is to avoid hostage exchange deals for the many more people that Israel hold hostage from both Gaza and the West Bank. But you didn't mention them, did you, Mike? A mission on your part, perhaps? Well, Redbridge themselves sought to address Mike Gapes for his horrible response, and they said, "Gapes and those like him have ruled over Redbridge for too long. He can see that the writing is on the wall and that change is coming. We reject his Hamas apologist line. We are shocked that he can sit by after 30,000 Palestinians have been killed and say nothing." Well, indeed. Gapes wasn't done, though. He shot back with, "These Hamas apologists don't like being called out for being identified as Hamas apologists. Perhaps it would be more convincing if they had denounced the misogynist, homophobic, racist, murderous death cult, which is Hamas. But they can't because they are Hamas apologists. Except they haven't mentioned Hamas, Milky, only you are. How about you denounce the plausible genocidalist of the Netanyahu regime? Don't be silly. They might not want to finance his next jolly to the Zionist state. 30,000 dead, 100,000 dead, missing and injured if you add all of those demographics up, and all you can do is try and fit the word Hamas as many times into a tweet as possible to attack a rival candidate. It's childish, it's racist, because it conflates being pro-Palestinian with being pro-Hamas. It reminds me of the fallout after Richard Madeley asked British Palestinian Lib Dem MP Layla Moran on Good Morning Britain if she knew if Hamas were planning to kill innocent Israelis by virtue of her just happening to be British Palestinian. This is the same thing. He's doing the same thing to Liam Mohammed, also being British Palestinian. But it also shows beyond doubt the sort of people that are welcome in Starmer's Labour since Gates was happily readmitted to the party last year. Redbridge followed this up with, "It's good to see what Mike Gapes thinks of those who oppose the slaughter of tens of thousands of women and children. For decades we and our family supported people like Gapes at the ballot box. No more. Redbridge Labour and Wes Streeting, do you condemn his comment?" No response from either of them to that tweet, but some solidarity was certainly shown, for example by the Newham Independence Group in response to that, who said, "Labour are furious that those communities whose votes they took for granted for decades are no longer theirs. Liam Mohammed, keep up the good work and let's consign Labour to the history books in East London and beyond." Hear, hear, more of that and more solidarity please, as Liam Mohammed said in her speech on Saturday. Solidarity is a verb. It's an action word after all, so take some action on that. Someone else who showed solidarity with Leanne and Redbridge Community Action Group in that last tweet as well is the, hopefully he's going to stand now that he has won the OKISA selection to stand against Keir Starmer in Holborn, Andrew Feinstein, the former South African ANC politician and who is notably Jewish and the son of Holocaust survivors. And he's also a lifelong opponent of the global arms trade, so steady as you go, Milky. In his reply to Redbridge's tweet, Feinstein wrote, "Mike Gapes has been a shill for British imperialism and the UK's deadly corrupt arms trade as long as he's been in public life. His support of the Saudi war on innocent Yemenis and Israel's slaughter of innocent Palestinians is par for this reactionary zealot." Well, Feinstein does not mince his words whatsoever. It's one reason I really hope he does go head-to-head with Starmer, because Starmer, frankly, will not know what's hit him. Feinstein is the genuine article. Starmer is an establishment stooge. There is just no comparison there. Anyway, Gapes can't let these things go. He will just sink to ever lower depths and shot back at Feinstein with, "Oh dear, I'm now being trolled by trots and tankies for the Tories." Well, you're the one in the Tory party B team, Milky. Feinstein stands opposed to Tories both blue and red. But the trots and tankies is just the laziest response going, and Gapes clearly thinks it's ever so funny and ever so clever because he literally uses it all the time. He used it twice alone on the 16th of February, the day after the two by-elections last week, both in response to those results where Labour, of course, both won them, one being a relative turn given that between the two seats they lost over 5,000 votes, and to a national poll that came out on the same day giving Labour a 20-point lead. And he just tweeted out, "Trots and tankies will be furious. Basically, everyone on the left is a communist, according to Gapes. If you're not backing Labour, you're a commie." These are the insults of the lazy and simple-minded, harking back to a time long past. And that's exactly where Gapes is, still striving to be relevant by being a malicious noise, now thankfully outside of political relevance. What he is proving by his ongoing attacks on independent candidates standing against awful Labour MPs, though, is how scared he is, and therefore that faction is, of being beaten come the general election and some big names going down because they don't have very big majorities to back their mouths up. With any luck, they'll be joining Gapes in political irrelevance and oblivion very soon and staying there. As for those by-election results the trots and tankies will be furious over, not really. Labour, as I said a moment ago, collectively lost more than 5,000 votes. Labour's lead, Labour's shot at power, is clearly dependent on the Tory voters staying at home, as this video will explain all the details of, because that was the real story of both of those by-elections. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so as I spoke about in another recent video, Keir Starmer and Labour have been polling Muslim voters to gauge how much damage has been done to the party's reputation amongst a demographic they have historically always been able to rely on, given the party's incessant support for Israel. Starmer's admission that Israel have the right to cut off water, food and fuel, something he has never apologised for, has just denied ever saying, despite it being on TV, on film forever and a day, saying otherwise. Starmer has led his party in lockstep with the Tories on this matter and abstained when the SNP put forward a vote on a ceasefire amendment last November. He has taken that Muslim vote for granted, and the people are turning their backs on his party and looking at other options because of it. Other options which are rapidly making themselves known as independents and community organised candidates step up to represent a lot of people for whom they feel quite justifiably do not represent them anymore. Now, polling done by the Labour Muslim Network showed Labour might have lost as much as half of their Muslim voter base. But has Labour's internal polling shown it is that bad as well, or worse? Frankly, it's the only explanation for Starmer's most recent speech. Right, so Labour's Muslim vote, it's sunk from a high of 86% under Jeremy Corbyn to potentially as low as 43% under Starmer, according to the Labour Muslim Network, though that stat does include don't knows. It was publicised previously that as long as Labour's support amongst Muslims didn't fall below something like 20%, Labour could get away with ignoring them. So this about-face from Starmer, or what appears to be, I've got issues with it, in the form of a speech to the Scottish Labour conference yesterday, appears to have U-turned on a ceasefire. Given how beholden to the Zionist lobby he and his party are, well, it strikes me that his internal polling might actually be a damn sight worse than the Labour Muslim Network's findings, and sufficiently so to be a threat to Starmer's dreams of entering number 10. Now, the Zionist lobby know he's their man. Him changing his tune now for cynical political gain, for damage limitation, well, they'll probably understand that, I would think. Once in power, no longer needing votes from anyone, he'll do as always intended, I'm sure. First impressions of people do matter, after all. Starmer has failed to stand against Israel repeatedly, changing his tune now with the list of lies he's got to his name by this point, 4 years into his leadership. You'd have to be a right fool to believe him. For a start, what has actually changed? The ICJ provisional orders and ruling came down weeks ago. He can't say that is his reason. Netanyahu's batshit rhetoric and that of his far-right coalition partners have been going on for months. He can't put it down to them either. Is it just a case now that he had a number of deaths in mind, a target, a goal that has finally been reached? Was it the 12,000 dead children his limit? 19,000 children orphaned? 30,000 deaths, all in? Was that the target he had in mind? The only thing that has actually changed is the death toll. And as a former human rights lawyer, does he really only see these people as numbers at the end of the day? Now, my opinion of Starmer is a low one. But if it ever comes out that that has any ring of truth to it, my opinion of him will go far, far lower. I think it more likely that his run at number 10 is under threat because the Muslim vote has abandoned him in larger numbers than might have previously been thought. But let's turn to what he said to Scottish Labour conference upon returning from a security conference in Munich first.
An end to the fighting, not just now, not just for a pause, but permanently. A ceasefire that lasts, conference, that is what must happen now. The fighting must stop now. Our conference. Any ceasefire cannot be one-sided. It must stop all acts of violence on both sides. And it must lead to a genuine peace process. Because the offensive threatened on Rafah, a place where 1.5 million people are now cramped together in unimaginable conditions, with nowhere else for them to go, this cannot become a new theatre of war. That offensive cannot happen. And even in these most terrible of circumstances, the two-state solution must be back on the table. A safe and secure Israel, where the horror that Hamas inflicted on October the 7th, the largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, could never happen again. And alongside that, a viable Palestinian state, a state which is not in the gift of any neighbour, but is an inalienable right of the Palestinian people and is recognised by this party and the world.
An end to the fighting, not just now, not just for a pause, but permanently. A ceasefire that lasts. Conference, that is what must happen now. The fighting must stop now. His words. No longer is he talking humanitarian pauses. He's talking permanent ceasefire. And you have to remember who he is talking to here. Scottish Labour have been backing a ceasefire for a while. They have bucked the National Party. They've been shaming them fundamentally. They actually passed a motion for an immediate ceasefire the day before Starmer addressed them. So for Starmer to turn up and actually say anything else to them, well, we'd be talking about him having had a car crash conference appearance possibly, instead of what many are saying is a big shift and a bid to win back those Muslim voters I suspect he's lost an awful lot of. Here's the thing though. Calling for a permanent ceasefire without saying when isn't a change in position for Starmer at all. He has said before he wants the fighting to end and that it takes both sides, but without saying when. Now you might say, but Damo, you're contradicting yourself here. He said now. He wants a permanent ceasefire now. Except he didn't. He said he wants the fighting to stop now. He said the fighting has to stop now. He wants a permanent, sustainable ceasefire that leads to a genuine peace process, but didn't say when in relation to that. We all want the fighting to stop, but a ceasefire is a political stance requiring negotiation, and without the US on board, and they are still ruling out a ceasefire, there's actually no movement here. Starmer also isn't in power, and he might think this puts the Tories in an awkward spot, but it doesn't, not really, because they still hold a working majority. Would enough Tories join with the SNP ceasefire vote to change that? Well, none of them did before, so there's no point assuming any would now, is there? And of course that brings me on to the bigger question of whether Starmer would, because of course if he means a permanent ceasefire now, why did he not say an immediate ceasefire instead? That is, after all, the wording of the SNP Opposition Day vote coming this Wednesday, which will be a vote for an immediate call for a ceasefire. It won't deliver one, but it shows intent. It actually would do Labour no harm to back it. It would do them more harm not to. But, and it's a big but, you have to recall that when the SNP laid down their ceasefire amendment last November, Labour abstained, apparently because Starmer felt to agree with the SNP would damage their chances in Scotland. Now, of course, Scottish Labour are on board with a ceasefire. It would surely damage Labour's chances to not agree with a ceasefire, particularly in light of Starmer's recent appearance at their conference. But an immediate one? Will Starmer vote for that? Vote accordingly? Well, we will find out on Wednesday, won't we? It would also prove Starmer was wrong about Scottish voter feeling. Not that being wrong for him is anything new, but admitting it would be. Starmer made a pretty speech in Scotland. They lapped it up. Those that were there, anyway. The Guardian claimed it was the biggest showing of Labour members at a Scottish conference in Scotland for decades. But this picture implies otherwise. That hall only holds about 500 people and was definitely not full, so pathetic shilling from the liberal mainstream press and a show of what a turn-off Starmer is, even amongst his own party and members, and likely in no small part due to his ongoing refusal to back an immediate ceasefire. But hey, maybe he did mean it and just didn't mention it, eh? Well, we've only got until Wednesday to find out, don't we? Because the SNP motion calls for an immediate ceasefire, condemnation of Israel's attacks on Rafah, which Starmer also made mention of, and the crisis affecting the people trapped there, and condemns the collective punishment by Israel on all Palestinians. Labour have apparently claimed they are in discussions with the SNP over their ceasefire motion, which has built up some excitement and some expectation amongst their supporters. But it should come as no surprise that the SNP's Westminster spokesman, Stephen Flynn, has shot this down, tweeting out, "The Labour Party has stated that they are in discussions with the SNP on our immediate ceasefire motion. This is not true. Nevertheless, I am more than willing to meet with Sir Keir Starmer to discuss this hugely important issue prior to Wednesday's vote." Why lie about it then, Keith? It's a big stretch for Starmer to go there and back that vote on Wednesday. If he does, then for one, I think he's probably been given permission to by the lobby, and for two, he's figured it's worth it even if he doesn't mean it later on, which would be completely in keeping with Starmer, because when is Starmer's word worth anything? If he abstains again, or worse, then this was all a load of hot air for the Scottish faithful, and nothing more. Hot air summing up 4 years of Starmer's leadership. Besides, did David Lammy give the game away on Laura Kuenssberg's show on Sunday regarding Starmer's true intent on the SNP ceasefire motion, despite what Starmer said in Scotland later on? I'll find out all about that little story on this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so if there is one thing literally nobody in their right mind should be doing right now, it is praising the so-called most moral army in the world. You'd have to be as mad as Benjamin Netanyahu to even consider such a stance regarding the Israeli Defence Force. But then, this is what happens when you have an unelected upper chamber stuffed with party loyalists who have a job for life and make an absolute joke of our so-called mother of all parliaments, so permanently detached from the real world as they are. I am, of course, referring to the House of Lords. It's not a democracy, it's an archaic leftover. The vast majority of the people going in and getting paid £332 a day are getting paid to have a kip or wade through whatever Tory obscenity is getting made into law, get a discounted dinner and just sit around farting dust all day. But for someone here and now to stand up and praise the army of a regime against whom a plausible case for genocide has been found is a massive problem. Though sadly, being a Conservative, they'd probably sooner shake his hand than censure him. Right, so, praising the IDF for how many Palestinians the IDF have killed, acceptable casualties in light of taking out Hamas operatives, given Israel are being, as we know, dragged through The Hague on the basis of a plausible case for genocide, really ought to be seen as incitement, frankly, shouldn't it? The IDF should be condemned by everyone in the strongest possible terms, and the Lord in question should be sat down and made to watch, perhaps, some of the hundreds of thousands of videos that are being posted to social media that are showing the aftermath of the IDF's actions, the destruction of public infrastructure, the snipers shooting innocent victims in the street, and so much more. Much of it far more harrowing than I care to describe. I don't think I actually need to, because this genocide is playing out before all of our eyes via social media in real time, that we know what is happening there. So I fail to see how this elevated gentleman can have got it so wrong, especially given he is also apparently a military historian, no less. Have a listen to this.
Even if we were to take Hamas's statistics as accurate, the 27,500 figure, and there's no reason why we should, because we don't do that with Putin, we don't do that with ISIS. If one subtracts the number of Gazans who've been killed by the quarter or so of Islamic Jihad and Hamas rockets that fall short, one's left with a fewer than 2-to-1 ratio of civilians to Hamas terrorists killed, of whom there have been over 9,000 so far. My lords, war is hell, and every individual civilian death is a tragedy. But speaking as a military historian, less than 2-to-1 is an astonishingly low ratio for modern urban warfare, where the terrorists routinely use civilians as human shields. And it's a testament to the professionalism, ethics, and values of the Israeli Defence Forces.
That was Lord Andrew Roberts, Baron Roberts of Belgravia. Got stuffed into the Lords by Boris Johnson in his 2022 honours list, and so taking a peerage from that bloviating buffoon should be a red card from the start. As a military historian, as he said, Roberts has written numerous books. Perhaps it was his biography of Winston Churchill that happened to win Bozo over. It certainly had the Tory press gushing all over it. But not all of his historical works have been as well received as that one was. He, for example, wrote another biography of Napoleon Bonaparte, which the BBC turned into a 3-part mini-series, no less. And on that series, even the Torygraph tore it apart. The Daily Telegraph was quoted as saying it was unconvincing, saying that there was no getting away from Roberts's regular lapses into hero worship. And Roberts's remarks on the refreshing qualities of dictatorship made me wonder if he had taken leave of his senses. The Torygraph there. A fan of the dictatorial then, are you, Lord Roberts? Well, he's not above writing in the mad right-wing press himself either. He penned, for example, an article in the Daily Fail just last December entitled, "Why Hamas Are Worse Than the Nazis." We should just preclude him from any position of authority entirely on that alone, and obviously the Daily Mail as well, from being called a newspaper. Aside from that, he is a besotted royalist as well, because of course he is, having said, following the death of Prince Philip, that he was undoubtedly one of the reasons that the overwhelming majority of Britons today feel blessed that their country is a monarch. Oh, speak for yourself, Andy. He's also a besotted Thatcherite, because of course he is. It's par for the course for the Tories, both red and blue today, just as you'd expect for any true blue Tory, and indeed on par with his viewpoint of military history. Said of Tony Blair that he was a exemplary war leader with his vigorous prosecution of the war against terror, which would leave him regarded as a highly successful Prime Minister. Well, that's about as close to the truth as a Keir Starmer policy launch, really, isn't it? Please, no more. My ribs hurt. It's all too funny. Except it isn't. Roberts is also regarded as an Atlanticist, which means he believes in the relationship between the US and Europe to maintain order around the world, therefore. So it's little wonder he's coming down hard on the side of Israel with such gusting praise for one of the most amoral and depraved military forces on the planet, given their conduct. And now you know a little bit about Roberts and his military and political leanings, it may be not be so much of a surprise he thinks as he does in that piece of video there. He automatically questions taking Hamas's figures for civilian deaths at 28,500 and doesn't see why we should take any notice of those figures, because apparently bringing up Putin and ISIS as others we ignore figures from is somehow relevant here, because all terrorists are the same, presumably. For one, that terrorist label being applied to Hamas isn't an international one, it's our view of them, our government's view of them, the British government's viewpoint of Hamas. They are the elected government of the Gaza Strip, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you like them or not, that's a fact. And if you disregard and sneer at them, or not, dislike them because you're on the side of Israel, US-backed as they are, Atlanticist as you are, their figures have always been good enough for various other global publications, other international governments, and various bodies, not least of which the United Nations itself. The Gaza Ministry of Health figures have been historically found to be, by and large, accurate ones. Now, you could quibble military fatalities, especially in an ongoing war zone, because they're going to change all the time. Of course they will. They will never be bang on for very long. But Hamas are accurate in their reporting so far as they are aware. The same cannot be said of Israel, who lie about everything with impunity on the matter of fatalities, including who's committed them. It did, after all, take Israel 6 weeks to figure out they'd counted 200 too many Israeli fatalities in the aftermath of October 7th. Not only because their own counts are inaccurate, but because the bodies were so badly burned by their own forces, they didn't realise they'd accidentally counted 200 Hamas insurgents. Roberts offers no basis for his judgment here. It is his opinion. And when even the most loyal of Tory publications has in the past questioned his ability to avoid his own inbuilt bias in his writing, how can we judge his thinking any differently? He came up with this ratio of 2-to-1 in regards to Hamas agents killed compared to Palestinian civilian deaths, which is bonkers, given nearly 30,000 people are now dead. Roberts quotes a figure of 9,000 or more Hamas operatives that have been killed, but this is actually the high end of US estimates, and saying or more is pushing even that, because their estimates could be as low as 5,000. That would be a ratio of 1 Hamas operative for every 5 civilians at worst, or 1 Hamas operative to every 3.3 civilians at best. Certainly Roberts is taking that better end of that picture as read, and justifies his 2-to-1 figure based on subtracting civilians killed by rockets falling short that have been fired by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, of which he quotes no actual numbers. Nobody has those figures. That's just a guess. It also implies that the US estimates are not taking such things as that into account either, so you're undermining the accuracy of their figures. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad stopped firing rockets for the whole month of December into January, at the end of December, when South Africa filed its court case against Israel at the ICJ. They only resumed approximately a month later their rocket fire when Israel were blatantly not keeping in line with the ICJ ruling. That's a whole month where those deaths, any deaths in Gaza, cannot be attributed at all to Hamas or Islamic Palestinian Jihad, at all to what Lord Roberts had actually said. During that time, Israel carried on moving people down through the Gaza Strip and killing people with impunity, though. We know that. We've watched it. We've observed it. Do you know the figures Roberts admitted to include in any of his rambling, though? He didn't mention at all. Well, let's take the 127 journalists killed. Hamas have no interest in killing journalists. They want them to record what is happening. We all know who doesn't. 136 UNRWA workers have been killed. People who help Palestinian refugees, working for an agency we know Israel hates and sees as a block to them taking over. How about the wanton destruction of infrastructure in Gaza then? Over 200,000 homes destroyed, 3 churches damaged. The same can be said for 522 mosques. There's 246 healthcare facilities destroyed, along with 317 healthcare professionals killed. Gaza is being rendered unlivable on purpose, and it is not in Hamas's interest to be the ones doing that. Still, 2-1 he says. War is hell. Those are good stats, all things considered. Well done to the IDF. Hamas are using civilians as human shields, so they're even better than my made-up figures consider them, but I'm a military historian, therefore you should just take me at my word. Hamas and the human shield story, only provided again by Israel, and again without proof. Hamas are hiding in the hospitals, they've told us. They're hiding in the schools. They're in amongst the civilian population, but that has been Israel's excuse to excuse its indiscrimination in its attacks. And instead of condemning Israel for that, instead of mentioning even once the fact it is Israel on trial for genocide and not Hamas, no case has been brought against Hamas. Yet you've got 55 countries in The Hague yesterday and again today presenting their case against Israel for their historic occupation of Palestinian territories. You're backing the wrong horse here, Sunshine. All the evidence that he's clearly ignoring, that aforementioned inbuilt bias, or Roberts just isn't as big an expert as he'd like you to think he is in military history, you decide, means he's ignoring what is evidenced, and what is on trial even, in favour of things that are not. That he's in a position to make laws in this country despite not having been elected, and we're paying him to have these views and air them publicly, is frankly terrifying. He's praising the IDF for their professionalism, ethics and values. And all because they haven't killed as many Palestinians as he thinks they could have, based on figures I can only conclude he's made up. Well, they're on the verge of entering Rafah right now. What will your excuses be if they do, with everything the rest of us who aren't completely deluded fear will happen then? Do you know what else the most moral army in the world is doing, by the way, Lord Roberts? Going through abandoned houses and kitchens that haven't been blown up yet, and taking part in lifestyle puff pieces for the adoring Zionist masses, showing what they can cook up with the stolen food they're scrounging as they progress through Gaza. What would you think of that, then, I wonder? Waste not, want not, while the people who left starved to death in Rafah now as aid supplies can't get through? Is that what you'd think? Well, you can find out all about that particular story on this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer is going to whip his MPs not to abstain this time on the SNP's ceasefire vote tonight, apparently, as he did last time, but he's actually going to back the Tories wholeheartedly and whip his party to vote against it. Labour will vote against the ceasefire in Gaza. A 3-line whip is being laid down, so any of his MPs rebelling and voting with the SNP face possible censure, and any front benchers who do so will face the sack. His reasons for it this time? The usual accusations against the SNP of playing politics. But actually that is exactly what Starmer is doing. And despite the SNP motion not having a hope of passing, even if only the Tories voted it down, Starmer is refusing to back it, we're told, over one line in it. And that really does bear paying close attention to, because if true, Starmer's stance hasn't budged an inch from the very beginning of these latest atrocities following October 7th, and that makes him one very sick individual indeed. Right, so I covered the SNP ceasefire motion the other day in a video, but here's a reminder of the wording of it. That this House calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel, notes with shock and distress that the death toll has now risen beyond 28,000, the vast majority of whom were women and children, further notes that there are currently 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering in Rafah, 610,000 of whom are children, also notes they have nowhere else to go, condemns any military assault on what is now the largest refugee camp in the world, further calls for the immediate release of all hostages taken by Hamas and an end to the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, and recognises that the only way to stop the slaughter of innocent civilians is to press for a ceasefire now. Let's also remind ourselves a moment of what Keir Starmer said to Scottish Labour conference just the other day. Scottish Labour backing a ceasefire as well, as it happens. And he told them, an end to the fighting, not just now, not just for a pause, but permanently. A ceasefire that lasts. Conference, that is what must happen now. The fighting must stop now. He told Labour members in Scotland that he wanted a ceasefire, and now, instead of that, he's actually going to vote against it, it would seem. All the protests, all the fallout, 10 frontbench resignations last time when he whipped to abstain on a ceasefire amendment last November, but no, not this time. This time, it looks like he's actually going to vote against it, and there will be a 3-line whip in place over his own party on that. Not only is this proof that he will happily lie to the faces of his own members on the matter of a ceasefire, completely contradicting what he said in Scotland just 2 days ago, but the reasoning behind it shows he's not actually changed at all. The line that Starmer apparently has a problem with in the SNP motion is the one that says, calling for an end to collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Because Starmer apparently hates this line. It is a red line for him. That is why the motion must be voted against now, apparently. This reminded me early doors back in October of Starmer being asked whether Israel had the right to cut off food, water and fuel. It is still one of the standout, most awful political comments made since October 7th by any British politician, and Starmer has never apologised for it, only denied he ever said it, despite it being said on TV and for all the world to see and still going around on social media now, as it always will. But as we know, cutting off such essentials is a war crime. It is collective punishment. And we know Israel did it, and we know they've kept on denying aid to the area, and we know they have killed civilians indiscriminately for 4 months, leading to the deaths of some 30,000 people, of which some 12,000 are children. We know collective punishment has been committed by Israel. It was a significant part of the evidence by South Africa against Israel at the ICJ too. Yet here we are, late February, 4 months on, still no apology from Starmer for his advocation of collective punishment. He never apologises for anything, after all. And this act now to oppose a ceasefire and slap a 3-line whip on it as well, because of calls to end collective punishment, well, to my mind, it means he didn't misspeak in the beginning, did he? He meant what he said, didn't he? And despite being a human rights lawyer, as he is always telling us he is, that plays secondary to his political ambition and his acquiescence to Israel, even as they stand accused of a plausible case of genocide. It's also worth noting that the Scottish Labour Conference passed a ceasefire motion the day before Starmer addressed them, which included the line, "Conference supports Israel's right to protect its citizens in line with international law, affirms that Hamas remaining in Gaza is not tenable, and agrees there is no justification for the collective punishment of 2.2 million citizens in Gaza." What a pity they aren't leading the National Party right now, it would appear. We might get a little bit more common sense on this. We know the SNP motion won't pass, so making it a vote of conscience would be the smart, empathetic thing to do for Labour. Instead, Starmer would rather show the whole country his control freakery again, and his lies again, in deference to the Israel lobby. Voters want to see a ceasefire, want to see their politicians stand up for what is right and just and humane, but neither leader of either main party is prepared to do it. Now, you expect the Tories to be like this, a more hateful bunch of politicians you couldn't ever hope to meet. But people do expect Labour to be better. Labour is held to a higher standard. Instead, they are exactly the same now under the politicians leading them. Starmer and co are playing politics with people's lives. And so, of course, to compound their depravity even further, that is exactly what they are accusing the SNP of doing. One notable example, given Scottish Labour's agreement with the need for a ceasefire, still in opposition to Starmer's position, despite telling them he backed a ceasefire just 2 days ago, as I said, was a response by Scottish Labour MP Ian Murray to a tweet by Scottish Lib Dem MP Alistair Carmichael, who was complaining that the Lib Dems had reached out to the SNP to get them to include a message of the need for a political process and the two-state solution, to which they've been rebuffed. Well, Murray said, "My experience too. When government has a majority of 60 and you don't want to work with others to try to win the vote, then it's clear the purpose of the motion is not to win it. Submitting a motion to deliberately fail while telling the public it'll pass is deplorable, especially given the subject." Well, the SNP know it will fail. The Tories will ensure that. They have a majority, as you just admitted. So it doesn't matter if the SNP worked with the entirety of the opposition benches. It would still fail. But it seeks to shame politicians who won't back it. It says to the world what Britain could and should be standing for. And by shaming politicians into opposing that or abstaining on it, it's showing the general public that they're completely out of step with all of us. And as was shown last time, the public will be incensed by this. The SNP haven't told anyone it will pass. Nobody can ever predict the outcome of a vote with certainty. So this is just a really pathetic, dishonest response to a really pathetic Lib Dem whinge. The SNP motion is solid. It says exactly what it does on the tin, and the SNP attitude is take it or leave it. And why not? Back a ceasefire for the reasons given, or don't, and answer to your constituents about that. At the end of the day, they stepped up to do this. The SNP get 3 opposition day debates per parliamentary session, just 3. Labour gets 17, so there's no excuse for them not to have done something about this by now. Just simply Starmer doesn't want to. And if you want to play politics with this matter, as you rightly say, that is deplorable. Look no further than David Lammy doing the rounds again. Hear what he said on Sky yesterday.
Could you hold your nose and vote for it if it is the best thing on the table tomorrow?
I don't want to do anything in an election year in which the Labour Party might have the privilege of serving that cuts across our ability to do that. And if you look at the detail of that SNP motion, it's not balanced. And that is the problem as I see it with the SNP motion.
It's an election year. I don't want to rock the boat if it might damage Labour's chances of getting into power. Voting against a ceasefire, saying to my constituents my job is more important than this vote or what you think about a ceasefire, is where I'm at. That's David Lammy, folks. Tottenham, he's been on the gravy train at your expense for more than 20 years now. You do need a change. But actually, it's more than just about the SNP and Labour here, because Starmer and his absolute loyalty to the Israel lobby has meant the Tories have been able to trap him here too. There's an argument that they have forced Starmer to choose between backing the SNP or opposing them, because, just like last time, Labour have tabled their own amendment to the SNP motion. And of course last time, when they abstained on the SNP vote, they were able to say, well, we did vote for a ceasefire because we voted for our amendment. The trouble is, this time the Tories have tabled an amendment too. And this is a big problem for Starmer because by convention, the Tories' amendment, being the party of government, means Labour's won't be heard. Their amendment will not be selected. But, and it's a big but, there are rumours circulating at the moment that the Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, is trying to get Labour off this hook by changing the standing orders so he can call Labour's amendment anyway. Whether he'll get away with it without the Tories kicking off, we'll have to see. At any rate, barring the Speaker intervening to help Labour, which will get called out for the blatant abuse of impartiality that it would be, this is how we now know Starmer will vote against, whereas before he was considering abstaining again. He's decided that voting against a ceasefire is his preferred option. He'd rather side with the Tories than side with what is right. He's so sure he's going to get into number 10 that he believes even now he can get away with doing this. He knows he will have a rebellion on his hands. Last time 56 MPs rebelled. This time it really should be more. And the bigger the rebellion, the weaker he's going to look. But there's no escape for Labour MPs who toe the party line this time either. There will be no get-out-of-jail-free card courtesy of their own amendment. So they are under a lot more pressure to do the right thing this time, to stand up against oppression and not play party politics along party lines to suit Starmer's pro-Israel backers. Protests outside constituency offices and Labour HQ are underway today as a show of that. Obviously, I'll cover what happens after the vote. The further fallout from how Labour votes if they see this through, as we're told Starmer is planning to do, will remain to be seen. But the Muslim vote is already abandoning him. Perhaps he figures these are still acceptable losses, though. I figured his Weasley words to Scottish Labour the other day was an attempt to offset further vote losses amongst that demographic. Perhaps I got it wrong. Perhaps I've called that wrong, in which case. But his performance to Scottish Labour, with what we now know he'll do tonight, what is expected he'll do tonight, save the Speaker intervening, really does expose the man's ardent dishonesty, even within the span of just 48 hours. All the details on that are on this video here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next bit. Cheers, folks. Right, so budgets. Many councils around the country have already passed their budget motions for the next year. Others are busy with it now, and these are some of the most important motions to pass for a council. It's how they intend to spend your money serving you, or supposedly you. As such, a budget vote not passing, well, that's typically seen as a de facto confidence vote in the leadership, be that the Prime Minister at a national level, or the executive of a council, be that a number of people, or a single mayor. Usually that comes around as an opposition defeat for the budget. It's really got to come to something when your own side bring down your own budget, though. That's a whole new level of incompetence and disarray. But this is exactly what has just happened in Newham, and their mayor is resolutely ignoring the writing on the wall. Right, so Newham Borough Council. I featured them in a number of videos over the last few months, a staunch Labour stronghold as that is, which has nevertheless seen defections and by-election defeats to a new independent grouping there, the Newham Independents, who now form the official opposition on the council. Which not only shows how in just a few months people have publicly swung behind these guys, but also how fed up people are of seemingly permanent Labour representation, overwhelmingly in control of the council as they have been since 1964. It's just one of those councils that never ever changes hands, and therefore is one of those councils where Labour are able to take their constituents for granted. That said, though, never before have they had, it would appear, such blatantly incompetent representation either. They got Starmered. This goes back to the suspension of the two parliamentary constituencies that form Newham, being East Ham and West Ham, represented by the Labour MPs Stephen Timms and Lynn Brown respectively. Both CLPs were suspended in 2021 due to allegations of electoral fraud and various other claims regarded by local members as spurious, shall we say. They'd dared elect lefties to all their officer positions, and this was Starmer's party now. We couldn't have that. London Labour definitely couldn't have that. 5,000 Labour members, therefore, were left without a voice. Now, Newham's Labour mayor at the time, and remaining so, is Roxana Fiaz. She came in 2018, and her tenure has been marred by accusations of picking on colleagues, treating people unfairly, so much so that in 2020, just 2 years into her first stint as mayor, almost a third of Newham Borough Council councillors signed a complaint against her, but were fobbed off by the council, who said it was a party matter. Fiaz is Starmer's sort, so no investigation ever came of it. One Labour councillor at the time quit the party over their refusal to investigate. So why not ditch her at the next opportunity, at the next local elections then, Damo? Well, those next set of local elections took place in 2022, and both of those Newham Borough Council area Labour constituencies were still suspended. So, oh, what a shame, London Labour thought. We suspended these CLPs. I guess we'll just have to nominate the mayoral candidate ourselves, and we think you can keep Roxana Fiaz. This triggered an attempted legal action against the Labour Party for abusing the rules of its own rulebook for not investigating Fiaz before. But ultimately she got re-elected Newham mayor because of central Labour interference. Of course, following this, we've seen the rise of the Newham Independents. Mahmoud Mirza was the first, leaving Labour as he did over the ongoing suspensions of those two CLPs, standing as an independent and becoming the first independent ever elected to Newham Borough Council, beating Labour. This was followed by the election of another independent, Sophia Naqvi, last year, and a Labour defection to their grouping has led to them now numbering 3, making them the official opposition. Numbering 3, such is Labour's overwhelming representation though. Poor leadership, getting people's backs up and imposition by the central party has led to Fiaz's reputation amongst her peers plummeting. For example, an excerpt from a Labour List article from last October reads, "An investigation into an East London council has concluded that poor relationships among councillors have contributed to council scrutiny, not performing as it should, identifying a real personal animosity between certain councillors and the mayor. A report on Labour-run Newham Council, produced by the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, CFGS, warned that the local authority risks being trapped in a vicious circle, concluding that the impact of poor relationships on scrutiny leads to a further deterioration of relationships." Well, little wonder when the mayor has a track record of unpleasantness to the point formal complaints and even legal action were taken to try and do something about her, only for the central party to keep her in post. It also doesn't help matters when she has a member of the Labour Party National Executive Committee as her deputy mayor, supporting her all the way, just adding to a very divided atmosphere. This is a chap called James Asser. He's Newham's deputy mayor, and he's also the chair of the Labour Party National Executive Committee. He's also being touted for a safe Labour parliamentary seat, apparently. Rewards for shoring up a failing mayor, perhaps. I guess we'll see if that comes to pass. But with friends in high places, Fiaz has been, it seems, well protected. But maybe things have reached a tipping point with regards to this business of a budget, now that we've covered the background here. A budget, as I said at the start, is key to any elected leadership, and in the case of a mayor, to their very success as such, Roxana Fiaz wanted her budget to go through unamended by her Labour group, who met last Monday at 9 p.m. at night, no less. 9 o'clock at night? I call that a blatant attempt to try and play to people's desires to go home. However, no fewer than 15 amendments to her budget had apparently been laid down in a motion from the Budget Working Party, whose job it is to scrutinise the budget. And these weren't just minor tweaks either. They were root and branch evisceration of her proposals. And it meant for the first time in Newham Borough Council's history, there was a serious attempt to overturn a budget. At 10 p.m, the vote was called. 3 Labour councillors abstained, 27 of them backed Roxana Fiaz's unamended budget, and 27 backed the Budget Working Party's amendments, leaving the chair of the Labour group to have to cast the deciding vote. And she went with the amendments. Budget defeated by her own councillors. If Fiaz can't even get her own party group to pass her budget, how in hell can she think she can get it passed at all when she brings it to full council? This is resignation territory for a mayor. If you can't even pass a budget, you can't do anything. So, of course, the retaliation came. There was an attempt to overturn the vote, wasn't there? But to overturn the chair's ruling requires a 2/3 majority, and Fiaz had nothing close to that. So she now had a choice. Go back and rewrite your whole budget as per those amendments, or try and push it through like you want to anyway, and risk half of your own party group voting it down with all the public humiliation that comes with that. This is why budgets are considered de facto confidence votes. Because to lose on something so core, so intrinsic to the running of the entire council, diminishes your authority completely. You can't be seen to be really in charge if something that is supposed to represent your stamp on things can't get through, can't get passed. You're not really the leader. But to have your budget beaten by your own party before even being put to a vote, that's unheard of to me. There is weak and there is catastrophically out of control. How Fiaz has the brass neck to have not resigned on the spot, I don't know. But clearly she's squatting in a role where she's got no authority whatsoever. They were the days. There were days once upon a time. I remember them when I was a kid, when politicians had honour, of course, and they resigned over such things. Did the honourable thing. Instead, the people of Newham remain lumbered with a lame duck mayor who inexplicably thinks she can still run a council. And it says nothing of Central Labour either if they continue to less her, destroying Labour's reputation in Newham still further. But with so much representation there still, perhaps they figure they can get away with it. The only thing this Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer, will listen to is losing. And that's what they deserve to do big time if Fiaz is left in post for another 2 years. Well, that'd be the Central Party attitude anyway. Locally, the party are known to be somewhat sore losers, as this video recommendation here will tell you all about, and how much the independents on Newham are getting their backs up. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so if you hadn't been convinced before yesterday that Labour are actually a corrupt sham of a party under Keir Starmer, you really ought to be by now if you've read up on or watched the scenes that came out of Parliament last night. But if you're one of those people still wondering what the heck happened in Parliament, allow me to clue you in and expand on the actual ramifications here, because what has happened is absolutely unprecedented. A never-before-seen level of duplicity and coercion at the expense of a people upon whom genocide is being enacted for no other reason than to save Keir Starmer some embarrassment. And by the time you've got to the end of this video, I hope you'll be asking yourself, if he's this bad now, just how bad will things get if he ever gets into power? Right, so yesterday was an Opposition Day debate for the Scottish National Party, would you believe? If you watched things, you might have been forgiven for thinking it wasn't. It was their chance to debate their business, despite not being in power, being in opposition, hence the name. They were, of course, as many will be aware, bringing back a ceasefire vote on the situation in Gaza that they'd brought an amendment over previously. And as I've covered in a couple of videos now, they brought a motion that basically, if you want to hear the full motion, I've covered it twice on other videos, so I won't do so again here. But they were calling for an immediate ceasefire whilst also condemning Israel for committing the crime of collective punishment, making no effort to differentiate between civilians and Hamas, which have of course led to the appalling death toll of nearly 30,000 people, of which 12,000 are children. And of course, we've seen the situation out there for ourselves, haven't we? Hundreds of thousands of videos across social media, explicit and horrifying as they need to be. Because for too long in the West, we've been immunised against such scenes by a media who just wouldn't broadcast them. Where in the past, before social media, many were readily condemning Palestine as terrorists, not seeking the truth, not knowing the history, the media influenced how we thought heavily. They don't so much anymore. And that's on show, and that is what the SNP were standing up for, to finally make MPs stand up and be counted for doing the right thing. An opportunity for them to vote, not to end the fighting, because a vote here in the UK is of course only going to be academic as far as that's concerned. But it tells the general public of this country, who are overwhelmingly horrified, who have been demonstrating and marching and protesting for months now in the hundreds of thousands across this country, that they are on the same page as we are, that they are representative of us, that they are expressing the actual genuine will of the people. Well, it didn't go down that way. Despite the SNP only actually getting 3 opposition day debates per parliamentary session, Labour, who gets 17, managed to make it all about them. And the only vote that ended up passing was Labour's amendment to the SNP motion, which should never have been heard. Now, as you probably know, we have no written constitution in this country. We rely on archaic rules of convention and gentlemanly conduct and honour. But if you've ever met a politician, there's precious few of them you'd ever call honourable, despite what they might call themselves. By convention, via the standing orders of the House of Commons, the rule book as it is, if you like, because the Tories laid down an amendment to this SNP motion, their amendment, the government amendment, supersedes any that Labour might have laid down. And this is exactly what happened. The Tories laid down an amendment. They wanted to stick with the nonsense that is a humanitarian pause. Send in aid before the killing resumes. Stupid in every sense of the word. But they did this specifically to wrong-foot Labour. We'd been here before, as I said before. Last November we came to this. The SNP made an amendment calling for a ceasefire in a debate on these matters. Not an opposition day debate, it has to be noted. Labour also had an amendment in this one, watering that down, and where they voted against the SNP, Labour MPs could point to their sham of an amendment and say, by voting for that, we backed a ceasefire. They didn't. They backed a pause. 56 MPs rebelled over this matter. Starmer lost 10 front benchers over it because it was a sham. And it didn't fool anybody in the public, because there were numerous protests against Labour MPs outside their constituency offices following it. And it was a sham also because Labour were losing large chunks of the Muslim vote too. Now, as a result of the Tories this time laying down an amendment to an opposition day motion, convention stated that their amendment would be taken and not Labour's, because that is how it has always been done, under Standing Order 31. Now, Standing Order 31 applies to questions on amendments, but specifically in relation to opposition day motions, and it's not clear from the wording of the Standing Order, so I'm not going to go through it, it's just confusing. But essentially, if the amendment comes from the government, then the original motion is heard first, i.e. the SNP would go first with their motion as it stands unamended. But if another opposition party laid down an amendment, like Labour, they would actually go first, which is the normal way of hearing motions. If a motion comes before my town council, for example, I'm a town councillor, any amendments any councillor suggests will be voted on first, and if passed, those amendments are made to the original motion, which then becomes the substantive motion, and that is what gets voted on in the end. It is also convention on an opposition day motion for there to only be one amendment, and if the government makes that amendment, then that is selected over all others. So what should have happened is that the SNP motion was voted on first, and Labour would have had to choose to either back them or back the Tory amendment, which is basically what they abstained on previously in November, which caused so much damage amongst voters and caused internal uproar. The Tories basically made an amendment, not for any real reason other than to cause Starmer a headache. They were playing politics. Now, many are arguing, and amongst all of this, that that is exactly what the SNP were doing, especially Labour supporters, funnily enough. But the SNP brought the motion. They used one of their 3 opposition days for this, for Gaza. I don't think that excuse washes at all. It's a pathetic excuse. And you know that, because if the Tories had done what Labour did, Labour figures would be shouting from the rooftops about it. So, the trap was laid for Keir Starmer over that SNP amendment. Instead, what happened, allegations made by several mainstream media figures from Channel 4, the BBC, Sky, is that Keir Starmer himself, possibly accompanied by Sir Alan Campbell, the Labour Party Chief Whip, and they went to see Speaker Lindsay Hoyle in his office and demanded he call their motion as well. Otherwise, he needn't expect Labour's support to resume his position as Speaker after the general election, when we will be treated to the spectacle of MPs dragging him to his place. Hoyle is ambitious. He likes his spot as Speaker. He wants the peerage that usually comes after it, denied to his predecessor, John Bercow, for being too fair or not Tory-leaning enough, you decide. He's a Speaker that doesn't want to rock the boat, and if he's the sort of Speaker who lacks the authority to stand against MPs no matter who they are threatening him, as is alleged, even party leaders, then he is completely pointless, and he can't have the confidence of the House of Commons. I'm going to come to Hoyle in more detail in another video, because that's a whole story all on its own, and it does need looking at. So look out for that video later on. Suffice to say, though, hell up ensued when Hoyle announced he was setting aside a standing order, a convention, to allow Labour's motion, which would, of course, now be heard first, as I outlined a moment ago. If that passed, that would become the substantive motion. Labour would have changed the SNP motion before the SNP would even have been able to take their motion to a vote on their own opposition day. This upset the apple cart no end, as you can completely understand. Hoyle was accused of favouritism, of being weak, of being leaned on. As I said, I'll come to him elsewhere. But worse, because the whole debate was on the clock, there was every risk that the SNP, on their opposition day, wouldn't get its motion heard if Labour's amendment had just even happened to fall, because it was eating up time already as it was. As Hoyle finished his announcement that this is what he intended to do, to absolute uproar in the Commons, Starmer took the opportunity to leave, audibly saying thank you to Hoyle as he left the chamber. The voice of Scotland in Westminster, in effect, would be gagged, and it gave Starmer his out too, because he could back his party's amendment and again point to that being voted for as proof of Labour backing a ceasefire, when actually what their amendment was to strip out mention of collective punishment from the SNP's motion and shoehorn in mention of Hamas, against whom there are no charges of genocide and who are not committing genocide, requiring the ceasefire. Labour's motion not only let Starmer off the hook, but as is always the case with him, it excused Israel as well. Well, someone in the Tory party, presumably, only they, aside from one SNP MP backed this, called for the House to sit in private at that point, because nothing quite says will of the people like turning the cameras off so we can't see what they're doing. This has only ever, well, this got voted down massively, but this has only ever happened twice since World War II. Twice since World War II has the House ever sat in private. So quite what the intention of this was, I've got no idea. Possibly to throttle Hoyle off camera. Who knows? We'll never know now. But the abuse of convention was too much for both the SNP and the Tories by this point, and both parties walked out en masse. The Tories withdrew their amendment in disgust, which I thought was a little bit rich, since I've not forgotten they did once illegally prorogue Parliament, but hypocrisy is nothing new to them. Anyway, Labour gleefully declared their amendment passing unanimously. It turned the SNP's day into a Labour motion. Scotland's been told in no uncertain terms that their voice doesn't matter. Labour hijacked the opposition day debate of the SNP and got the Speaker to do it for them. Hoyle bent the rules for Starmer, because Starmer was facing reputedly a 100-plus MP rebellion and faced more resignations from his front bench. So a huge favour was done for him by Hoyle, bailing out Starmer, having been trapped by his own devotion to Israel. Hoyle and Starmer played politics to defeat the only motion which sought the unconditional end to the slaughter in Gaza, and all to give Starmer cover when his pro-Israel leanings made life a little bit tricky for him. Labour made a vote for humanitarianism in Gaza all about political gain for themselves and protecting their leader. The Labour whips reportedly were grinning as they left the chamber after Labour's amendment went through unimpeded. Hoyle was dragged back to the Commons a little while later after having said his piece on the amendments, because he decided to scuttle off after that and leave the rest of the proceedings to his deputy. He came back with an apology, but made the claim that he did what he did. He felt this was necessary to protect MPs in their constituencies who might have been endangered by not being able to vote as they wanted to. And if MPs wanted to vote against a ceasefire, they need to own it. Besides, that actually sickens me more, since the whole point of this debate was to consider the plight of people being blown to bits right now by Israeli forces. I'm more concerned about them than MPs who voted or might have wanted to vote for that to carry on. If Starmer is this corrupt now, still in opposition, what will he be like in power? What kind of stunts can we expect him to pull then, especially if he has Hoyle under his thumb? What last night is exposed is the anti-democratic and authoritarian streak Keir Starmer has, and that it is a mile wide. I don't think it is any exaggeration after what we saw yesterday that this so-called human rights lawyer is a danger to democracy. If you thought the Commons was bad yesterday, the House of Lords is actually no better. Do check this video out of a Tory peer praising the IDF for its professionalism, ethics and values. People with a job for life we can't remove and who we don't elect, yet still make laws. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Lindsay Hoyle, Speaker of the House of Commons, but for how much longer, given he exposed himself to having been allegedly open to coercion and blackmail for the sake of hanging on to his precious speakership, now facing an ever-growing list of MPs signing an early day motion calling for a vote of no confidence in him. Keir Starmer was trapped by his own pro-Israel proclivities, was facing the largest Labour rebellion since the Iraq War, and Hoyle led him off after apparently being threatened with withdrawal of support by his own party, the Labour Party, to retain the Speaker's position upon resumption of Parliament following the general election expected later this year. Hoyle put himself first by putting Starmer's wishes above parliamentary convention, above parliamentary rules. That is unforgivable. For a Speaker to have been exposed as being too weak to stand up for his position against arguably the most corrupt Labour Party leadership ever means his position is untenable. He has lost the trust of the House. Nobody can ever trust him again to be even-handed or impartial. He's disgraced his position, and an apology and an attempted justification which nobody believes is going to save him, I don't think. Right, so if you've watched my other video on the shenanigans that went down on what was supposed to be the SNP's Opposition Day, you will know already that Speaker of the House of Commons Lindsay Hoyle allowed an amendment from Labour that, by convention, should never have been permitted. Do go and watch that to get all the gory details of how Parliament fell to rack and ruin last night, utterly failing to be a voice for the people, in becoming instead a vehicle to protect Keir Starmer from a rather tricky rebellion. Hoyle, by his own selfish desires to remain in his post after the next general election, it is alleged, allowed himself to be blackmailed basically by Team Keith, who told him to break convention, sideline a House of Commons standing order, and allow Labour's amendment to the SNP Gaza ceasefire motion, or they wouldn't support him to return as Speaker, and he'd need their votes to resume that position. It appears Hoyle bent to Starmer's will. That in and of itself renders his position as SNP Westminster spokesman Stephen Flynn quite rightly stated, untenable. A Speaker who can be coerced can never retain the trust of the House. He's not a Labour MP per se any longer, but if he's going to take orders from Starmer any time Starmer or the Labour whips choose to threaten him in his position, cannot remain in post, cannot hope to retain the trust, respect or order of the House of Commons. He ought to have resigned last night instead of coming up with a cock and bull excuse about protecting MPs. But if you're the sort of MP who wants to see genocide in Gaza carry on, then frankly you deserve to be held to account for that in the most forceful terms. Though of course I will not condone any violence. Still, motions and amendments cannot and should not be brought primarily on whether or not it is safe for MPs to debate those matters because they happen to hold abhorrent views. If that is how things go, then no longer are they serving the will of the people in any way, shape or form, but only themselves. And this was the most blatant example of that. All of this was to save Starmer from a rebellion of his own MPs. All of this was to look after Keir Starmer. Exposing that more than possibly anything else that has come out is a statement from the clerk to the Commons. And even more hilariously, this was possible because of something Hoyle himself had instigated, insofar as he established a procedure whereby if the clerk felt any of Hoyle's decisions comprised a substantial breach of the long-established standing orders or conventions, that the clerk should make a note of any such view, with Hoyle undertaking to inform the House if he had done so. Well, Hoyle made good on his word here at least, because this is exactly what the clerk did. The full letter goes on a bit and is a little bit technical in places, but the standout line from it is, the procedural impact of the decision taken today is that the first division is likely to be on the official opposition's amendment rather than on the SNP's motion, and depending on the outcome of any such division, it is possible that the House will not be able to vote on the SNP motion nor on the government's alternative proposition. Sure, all debates are on the clock. An extra amendment that time had not been allowed for? that's a problem. If the amendment passed, that would have meant the SNP's motion would be amended before the SNP were even given a chance to present their motion. And given it's their opposition day, that's disgusting. Well, something would drop off as well. Depending if the amendment didn't pass, for example, then the SNP may not have time to present their own motion either. So it's a double problem for the SNP. And as I said, it's their day. Why should Labour be allowed to do this? It could be the SNP's own motion on SNP Opposition Day not being heard. It's absurd. Hoyle allegedly had been told all of this and still went ahead. So good on the clerk for making public their concerns and demonstrating beyond doubt that what Hoyle did was out of order, and why. Blackmailed by Labour, abused convention by effectively ditching Standing Order number 31 to suit himself, has shown favouritism towards his party and bent the rules for Starmer, making a total sham of an order of business to acknowledge and vote to end the genocide against innocent Palestinian people in Gaza. Hoyle put himself first, because Starmer was putting himself first. Well, he's now brought the weight of Parliament down on his head. Today, an early day motion has been brought for MPs to sign and support, calling for a vote of no confidence in Hoyle. At time of writing, at least when I began writing, there were 33 signatures on this. By the time I finished and was getting ready to film, there were 59. A mixture of Tories and SNP signatories, and when they are both in agreement on something, you know it's got to be big, because they bloody hate each other in Parliament. In a further break with convention, where the Speaker typically does not get challenged for their seat in the general election, the Tories are now considering standing a candidate against Hoyle, no less, in his seat of Chorley. And another slant on this story, which is being shouted about a bit less, it's coming from some quarter certainly though, is Hoyle's recent trip to Israel last November, which some people might have noticed and remember, accompanied as he was by the rancid UK ambassador for Israel, no less, Zippy Hotovely, looking at the sites allegedly struck by Hamas in Israel. Alleged because there's a great deal of evidence suggesting many of the fatalities and much of the damage caused there was from Israeli forces and not as a result of the incursion. This is all evidence that's still being gathered. This is a day in court still to come in future, and a ruling to be made on that, of course. But as an impartial speaker, as the bloody Speaker of the House of Commons, why was he even there? Starmer's actions were completely in keeping with his pro-Israel devotion too. So as much as we're being told Hoyle was coerced or blackmailed by some in the media, could it possibly have been a chummier chat about it in actuality? Of course, if he and Starmer think they might have saved Labour here, what they've actually done is exposed the lengths they'll go to stand up for Israel. They scuppered a legitimate ceasefire vote. They treated the people of Scotland and their voices as secondary to everyone else. And they also exposed Labour under Starmer to be a venal, weak, frightened, amoral, self-satisfied and self-interested entity, completely oblivious or completely dismissive of public opinion. And Starmer and co still have the brass neck to say they want to serve us. They have zero intention of serving us. They intend to rule us. And criticising Israel will become virtually impossible. They'll make sure of that. I'm certain of that. If these are the lengths they're going to now, that's a given. These are people with absolute contempt for us and total contempt for every dead Gazan, still leaving more for dead with no more of a care about them either. Labour under Starmer, it is no secret, utterly disgusts me. Hoyle I've always thought was a weak letdown of a speaker, making us long for the return of John Bercow. But my opinion of Labour under Starmer is one of abject, visceral hatred now. They played politics. They stole an opposition day from the SNP, and they're doing nothing but gloating about it on social media today. Hoyle is far from the only one who needs to go now, because honestly, are you really going to vote for politicians who are grinning about what they've done here, what they did last night, bringing Parliament into complete disrepute? As I said at the beginning, there's more details on the ramifications, the actions and the allegations behind this story, what happened in the Commons last night, as well as specifically on Starmer and Labour's actions. Watch this video recommendation for all of that if you haven't already seen it. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the events of Wednesday's farce of an SNP Opposition Day are still prominent, still rumbling away in the news, which, thanks to the Speaker Lindsay Hoyle, of course, ended up becoming a Labour Opposition Day debate. But if Keir Starmer thought he was walking away with a win, he might be very much mistaken. Be it arrogance or stupidity, he's made a couple of admissions following the collapse of the SNP's Opposition Day debate, one of which was completely dishonest, the other has been making people wonder who exactly is in charge of the Labour Party now, and he's been reported for it too. So if you thought this was all over now and Labour had pulled off a coup benefiting Israel by excusing them of accusations of collective punishment and thinking Labour, being the party calling for a ceasefire, was a win, there might be a heavy price to pay for their stunt, and it's about time it was Starmer himself who was made to pay it. Right, so I'm going to start with a couple of video clips here from the same interview, a Sky News interview, one of which they actually pulled from social media, but not before being caught and saved by other people. Have a listen to this.
Having spoken to the President of Israel, i.e. having spoken to the people who are actually involved in trying to wait for this awful conflict, I can categorically tell you that I did not threaten the Speaker in any way whatsoever. I simply urged him to ensure that we had the broadest possible debate.
And your MPs?
Broadest possible debate, so that actually the most important thing, which is what do we do about the awful situation in Gaza, could be properly discussed by MPs with a number of options in front of them. That's the right thing to do. The Speaker did the right thing in making sure the debate was broad. But the tragedy is the SNP walked off the pitch because they wanted to divide the Labour Party and they couldn't, and the government walked off the pitch because it thought it was going to lose a vote. So we had one party that was simply seeking to divide on an important issue. The government has lost control of its own MPs and couldn't control the vote.
Right, so this interview was very much all about what happened on Wednesday during that SNP Opposition Day debate. That collapsed into a complete joke as it did, with Speaker Lindsay Hoyle changing the rules as it seemed to suit Labour, and accusation came quickly afterwards that he'd been lent on, he'd been blackmailed, he'd been threatened by Labour, by Starmer, or the Labour Whip's office, or Sue Gray even, somebody from the Labour Party, that he would lose Labour's support to return to the position of Speaker following the general election if Hoyle didn't call Labour's amendment to the SNP motion. Now, if you saw both of my videos yesterday, you'll know that this meant the Labour motion, if called, would have been heard before the Opposition Day Party's motion, which is not the done thing, isn't convention, because it means potentially that party, in this case the SNP, might not be able to bring their motion at all, either being timed out because of an extra amendment having to be dealt with within the allotted time, or because the amendment passes, changing their motion before they even get a chance to bring it. This is the crux of the hell up. The Speaker set aside a standing order for Labour's benefit, it appears, because Starmer, faced with backing the SNP motion, which included reference to Israel's collective punishment in Gaza, which he couldn't tolerate, or backing the Tory amendment, which he abstained on essentially back in November, put him in a bind. If he abstained on both, he wasn't backing a ceasefire at all, and all the public fallout that would create, with him sitting on the fence again, getting splinters in his backside, as would backing the Tories also cause fallout. Backing the SNP motion, which was sensible and sound, he just refused to do. He would not tolerate that criticism of Israel. Which now brings us to those clips you just watched. The first clip that came up, very short, is the one that Sky News deleted off social media because it apparently caused absolute uproar. Because Starmer said he'd spoken to the President of Israel, claiming he was speaking to the people looking for a way forward in this conflict. So you spoke to the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, then. That would be this guy, signing missiles to drop on Gaza. The guy who came up in South Africa's submissions to the International Court of Justice as one, for instance, having been quoted as saying of the Gazan people, "We are operating militarily according to rules of international law. Unequivocally, it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It is absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we are at war, we are at war, we are at war. We are defending our homes, we are protecting our homes. That's the truth. And when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we break their backbone. All Palestinians are guilty, the entire nation are guilty. Therefore, we're operating according to international law. That's his rationale. The fact 50% of the population of Gaza are under 18 means this war, this genocide, is against kids. Gaza has been described as a cemetery for children. South Africa, using his words against him, he's called that a blood libel, them doing that. But they aren't the only ones holding him to his disgusting verbiage. Since Herzog's trip to the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland led to criminal complaints specifically against him made there too. However, the nature of these have not been specified, nor specifically who was filed them. Hopefully we'll find out in due course. But that's the President of Israel, folks, and that's who Starmer apparently spoke to ahead of this vote on Wednesday. Why bring that up in relation to being questioned about what happened on Wednesday? Well, despite the shortness of the clip, Starmer inferred this was because he's one of the people dealing with the situation in Gaza as a justification. But it isn't a justification when Herzog is the Israeli president and is one of the people responsible, therefore, for the genocide itself, not dealing with it, running it. Therefore, why speak to him on this matter? You weren't asking for a ceasefire because the Labour amendment didn't really ask for one. Because without demanding an immediate ceasefire, you simply backed one at some indeterminate point in future. What his amendment also did was strip out the bits of the SNP motion that blamed Israel for committing atrocity, collective punishment, a war crime. And Starmer admits to having done that after having met Herzog at the security meeting he attended with David Lammy in Munich shortly before returning to speak to Scottish Labour, promising a ceasefire and then doing what he did afterwards to the SNP motion in the Commons. It is impossible to look at this situation and think, well, did Starmer just take orders and instruction from Herzog, in which case? The human rights lawyer, taking his lead, having spoken to someone whose words were used as part of the evidence accusing his country of genocide. Is it any wonder at this point people are beginning to think, well, perhaps it isn't just Palestine under Israeli occupation, but the Labour Party are as well? Sure, go ahead and vote Labour. Will we literally have our country run by Herzog and Netanyahu afterwards? Or will it be more like criticism of Israel becomes a criminal offence? Seriously, it makes you wonder, and especially on that last point, you wouldn't put it past them. Certainly we now know it was Starmer who went and spoke to Lindsay Hoyle, because the longer clip there showed, he admitted it. He denied threatening him, encouraged instead the broadest possible debate, he said, which does marry up to Hoyle's claims at the time he announced that Labour's amendment would be heard, that it was so that MPs could vote on his ceasefire motion that suited them, the broadest possible terms, broadening the debate to the point, sadly, that Israel ended up getting exonerated of any fault. You convinced the Speaker, let's put it that way, convinced, we'll stick with that word convinced, to set aside a House of Commons standing order to get your amendment heard on an opposition day, which wasn't Labour's, knowing that meant it would be heard first, and the Speaker, knowing this was a bad idea, because the Clerk of the Commons had told him, the Clerk of the Commons published a letter afterwards in the aftermath of Wednesday's opposition day debate pointing that out. So Starmer must have been very, very convincing if he wasn't threatening Hoyle to get Hoyle to break with parliamentary procedure. Starmer said it was all about Gaza, doing the right thing, but we all know what the right thing is, and it had nothing to do with Gaza. The boycott the right thing is to boycott Israel, end the arms trade with them, and demand an immediate ceasefire. That isn't what Labour put forward, though. In fact, it was pretty much the opposite of that. If Labour had been backing an immediate ceasefire, there would have been no need for an SNP Opposition day on it at all, because there would have been no need for one. What Starmer did was seek to muddy the waters and cause chaos. And that's exactly what he did. And that had nothing to do with Gaza. It had everything to do with facing a massive rebellion in his own party. He got his way, his amendment passed, the SNP motion never got voted on, the Tories withdrew their correctly submitted amendment, it supersedes Labour on opposition days as they are in government. Israel got saved, as did Starmer's blushes. He even then had the brass neck to say it was the SNP intentionally trying to split the Labour Party, because sure, using one of their 3 opposition day debates to split Labour is clearly what they're all about. You egotistical twonk. Labour have 17 opposition day opportunities in comparison. They haven't bothered with a ceasefire on one of them. And thinking of Gaza before now. So don't pretend that's the most important thing. A proper debate and a proper resolution is what he wants, he said in that last clip. Yet that is exactly what his actions sought to avoid. But if he thinks he's won, well, he might be about to get a rude shock. Having confessed to having spoken to Hoyle, people want to know exactly what was said now. Starmer said he didn't threaten him. If you still believe anything Keir Starmer says and take his word as gospel for anything, then you're a bit of a fool because he lies like a rug. But one person definitely not accepting his word is Alba Party MP Neil Hanvey. If you're wondering who elected the Alba Party in Parliament and don't recall them being mentioned at the last general election, it's because they didn't exist. This is the vehicle of former SNP leader Alex Salmond and 2 SNP MPs defected to Alba the month after it formed in 2021. Hanvey is one of them. Anyway, an allegation of coercion or blackmail against the Speaker of the House of Commons, well, You might be wondering by now if this was ever going to be something worthy of an actual investigation. Surely it should be. And quite right too. And as such, Hanby has reported Starmer to the Privileges Committee, saying that it is essential to establish if Starmer coerced the Speaker into putting forward Labour's amendment, because if so, that would make Starmer guilty of contempt of the House of Commons. If found guilty of that, he could face suspension from the House or even expulsion, which, given he's the leader of the opposition, really ought to make him, to my mind, and excusing my bias, of course, someone to whom an example ought to be made if found guilty. Of course, a suspension of more than 2 weeks could trigger a recall petition, dumping Starmer out of Parliament too. So this really could have enormous consequences for Starmer now. At any rate, Hanby's letter to the chair of the Privileges Committee, Harriet Harman, reads thusly. Dear Ms Harman and committee members, in the course of the last 24 hours it has been reported in the media and to the Chamber that the Leader of the Opposition, and or those acting on his behalf, applied unwarranted and unacceptable pressure on the Speaker of the House for political purposes. It has been alleged that this course of conduct was pursued to ensure that the Labour amendment to the SNP motion for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza was given priority as the Leader of the Opposition sought to prevent his members voting against the Labour Party whip. Furthermore, it has been alleged that the Speaker was subjected to coercive threats relating to the support he could expect to receive from the Labour Party in any upcoming general election to force his hand to break with convention and act against the advice of the Clerk of the House. In order to reassure the House, I am asking the Committee of Privileges to initiate an urgent and rapid investigation into the allegations set out above, including any and all related matters. I would also request that any such investigation specifically examine the actions of Leader of the Opposition and consider whether the Right Honourable Member's conduct amounted to a contempt of the House. Now, Harman, I can imagine, will want to try and get Starmer off this hook, but whether she feels able to is another matter. The Privileges Committee consists currently of 2 Labour MPs, 4 Tories and 1 SNP. So it'll be an interesting one if Hanby's complaint even gets accepted. Frankly, if it doesn't, things are just going to look so much worse for Parliament, as it will look even more corrupt. And this is especially true since Hoyle can't seem to get his story straight on these matters either, which I'm going to go into on my next vid. But Starmer hasn't just shown what appears to be contempt for the House of Commons, but also contempt for Gaza. All those people still suffering, still dying, still starving, and even now, it looks like he's putting Israel first. He's just the most appallingly awful politician I can think of. Even with the Tories in power, he's right up there. And you can find out more about that on this video recommendation here. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons, was he coerced or blackmailed into allowing Labour's debate? Well, he's had a bit of trouble keeping his story straight on this, because what he said on the day he announced he would hear Labour's Gaza ceasefire amendment on the SNP Opposition Day doesn't tally up with what Keir Starmer claims he said to him, and doesn't tally with his apology and reasoning after his world came crashing down around him, his authority busted and his integrity smashed. I can't see how any MP can believe he can be fair and impartial following this. If he was blackmailed, he'd do well to say. If it is his pro-Israel leanings, then that's another problem entirely, and another reason why he is unfit to be Speaker. But given he has also descended into petty Islamophobic attacks to try and save himself too, he needs to go even faster now than he did before. Right, so Lindsay Hoyle has come back to Parliament and apologised for making the wrong call on the SNP Opposition Day debate. Have a watch of this though, and keep in mind his reasons for having done what he did.
I made a judgment call that didn't end up in the position where I expected it to. I regret it. I apologise to the SNP. Just bear with me for a moment. I apologise, and I apologise to the House. I made a mistake. We do make mistakes. I own up to mine. I would say that we can have an SO24 to get an immediate debate, because the debate is so important to this House. I will defend every member in this House. Every member matters to me in this House. And it has been said, both sides, I never ever want to go through a situation where I pick up a phone to find a friend of whatever side has been murdered by terrorists. I also don't want another attack on this House. I was in the chair on that day. I have seen I have witnessed. I won't share the details, but the details of the things that have been brought to me are absolutely frightening on all members of this House, on all sides. I have a duty of care, and I say that. And if my mistake is looking after members, I am guilty.
Right. First, just to clarify a point there, an SO 24 is an emergency debate under Standing Order 24. So that's one standing order, at least, that he does believe in keeping. An emergency debate on Gaza. That isn't the same as letting the SNP have its opposition day back, though. He owns his mistakes, he also said. So he admits to sidelining Standing Order 31 and allowing Labour's amendment was a mistake when it was superseded by the Tories' amendment as per the convention on opposition days. However, he is now justifying that by saying he feared for members' safety in their constituencies, but he'd spoken with the police. Well, we now know he had spoken with Keir Starmer, because Starmer has said as much now. So why has Hoyle not mentioned that? But more, why is it only now that we're hearing this justification based on some sort of terrorist attack? And why would MPs fear such an attack based on siding with Gaza and backing an immediate ceasefire as per the SNP's motion? Here's another clip. This is what Hoyle said was his justification for sidelining Standing Order 31 before Wednesday's debate began.
Finally, I should tell the House that, in my opinion, the operation of Standing Order number 31, which governs the way amendments to the opposition day motions are dealt with, reflects an outdated approach which restricts order. You'll be going and not be voting. Well, that's the first one to leave then. If you want to, do it. Now then. Firstly, I should tell the House, in my opinion, the operation of Standing Order, which governs the way amendments to opposition motions are dealt with, reflects an outdated approach, which restricts the operations which can put the House. It is my intention to ask the Procedure Committee to consider the operation.
Yeah, so Standing Order 31 is outdated and restricts operations. What about the terrorists then? Where were they? You spilt your guts and bled your heart to the Commons afterwards. I thought you said you'd spoken to the police too. Members were in danger. Standing Order 31 has been in existence since 1967. It has been amended 4 times since then. The last time, so in its current form it has remained since then, was in 1985. Thatcher fiddled with this on all of those occasions, in case you wondered. So complaining about it and finding fault with it is actually a pretty Thatcherite thing to be doing. It's been fine for all this time since, right up until Starmer had some form of words with you. In what manner and what exactly was really said, I'm not prepared to take Starmer's word for, because his word is meaningless. But then so is Hoyle's, because he never brought up terrorism and the safety of MPs in his justification before the debate, only after the fallout, and it seemed he desperately needed something to save his own backside. It is shameful and it is pathetic that he's prepared to stoop to this now. How can we possibly believe this is the truth when previously he just claimed to not like the Standing Order, that actually it was outdated and inconvenient? Israel was going to be held to account by Parliament should the SNP motion have passed. They demanded an end to collective punishment, which we know Israel are doing, a war crime. We also know Keir Starmer supported that when asked about cutting off food and water on LBC on an interview we've all seen and heard, for which he has never apologised. Starmer's Israeli loyalty aside, though, Hoyle proudly spoke to Jewish News last month to their hack Lee Harpin about his family history and that his father, Doug Hoyle, now Baron Hoyle of Warrington, was a founder of Labour Friends of Israel. Now, I'm not completely certain whether Hoyle actually said that, because I can find no evidence whatsoever to back up Doug Hoyle's connection to Labour Friends of Israel. I'm happy to be corrected, but I've been unable to corroborate it myself. So there's been a doubt in my mind. A doubt in my mind from a Lee Harpin article. Surely not! He's got such a wonderful track record of honesty and integrity, after all. But, if true, certainly Hoyle has a pro-Israel viewpoint, and that's certainly backed up by him having visited Israel last November, with the two-state solution binning should have been expelled from months ago Israeli ambassador to the UK, Zippy Ottavali. But none of that excuses his later justification in the Commons complaining about it being a matter of MP safety all of a sudden in light of apparent terrorist threats of some kind that he won't go into. Of course, we've seen these happen. The genuine thing is horrifying. And no matter how awful our MPs might be, none of us should wish any of them dead, even if they might be voting accordingly for that to continue to be inflicted on the people of Gaza. We'd like to think we ourselves, we ordinary folk of the UK, are better than them, surely. But there's no ignoring the real thing as we don't forget Joe Cox, and we don't forget David Amess, and we don't forget the 2017 Westminster attack. But we aren't talking about those. We're talking about an opposition day debate, for heaven's sake. We're talking about MPs doing the jobs they were elected to do. And this is excusing them being able to do that, as they always have done, all of a sudden because it's anti-Israel and pro-Gaza? Well, who are these supposed attackers then? Who are the terrorists? Hoyle won't tell us. Is the IDF planning an attack? No, the inference was it would be a Muslim attack, wasn't it? If you don't back a ceasefire, people will get the MPs. Is that what you're saying? Well, clearly it must be, because this is now Hoyle's justification for letting Labour's amendment in, which gave Labour members an opportunity to vote for a ceasefire, but on Labour's terms, not on the SNP's terms, even though it was their day. Labour stripped out criticism of Israel and the immediacy of a ceasefire. No change in their position in effect. Therefore, by bringing up the spectre of further attacks on MPs, despite never having mentioned them previously, there's an Islamophobic dog whistle being blown here now. Muslim voters should be even more appalled at Labour, and Hoyle as well now in light of this. Certainly, people on Twitter are. Terry wrote, "Liar! If he was so worried yesterday he could have called all leaders in for a meeting. Instead he just met Starmer and pushed SNP's motion to the side. As for winding up hatred towards Muslim communities who have asked for a ceasefire for months, is just despicable." That's a good point, actually. Why didn't Hoyle have conversations with all party leaders if there were fears of a terrorist attack? Surely that would have helped to build a consensus and a way forward that was agreed on by all. But he didn't do that. And as we know, having never brought it up before, it smacks of the lowest form of lie going. Green Party activist Joe Belcher wrote, "Well done to Commons Speaker and Keir Starmer for stoking Islamophobia. People of all faiths and none have been campaigning and protesting to stop genocide in Gaza. Now we're witnessing a wave of Islamophobia from political commentators and racists coming out of the woodwork." And the Jews Sans Frontières account wrote, "Look at where we've got to, Britain. A Speaker of the House of Commons flagrantly lying to cover for racist war criminals and incite Islamophobia. And he might have succeeded with the latter. The former, not so much. Everyone knows Hoyle and Starmer are lying. It is rancid. Both really need to go. Hoyle surely can never win back the trust of Parliament, and stooping to racism means he should go twice as fast. His position is completely untenable. It was before he made these excuses. It is doubly now. If you want more detail about how cravenly Hoyle caved into Starmer based on the allegations made, check out this video recommendation here, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so it's now a month after the US and the UK decided to go to war against the Houthis in Yemen, who of course declared that they would stop all Israeli shipping in solidarity with Gaza. A blockade on Israeli shipping, and despite being the poorest Arab nation going, with its own civil unrest and having been on the receiving end of Saudi attacks for 8 years, they've made good on their threats, using drones and speedboats to drive off much larger ships and rendering the southern Israeli port of Eilat virtually redundant. The trouble is, we have the West going, how very dare you stop Israel from defending itself by committing genocide in Gaza? Who do you think you are? You need to know your place. And so came Operation Prosperity Guardian, chiefly led by the US and the UK. All this has achieved was those same drone attacks being aimed at US and UK shipping, and those two countries getting added to the Houthis' Red Sea block list. Then came the strikes against Yemeni land targets to try and stop the Houthis, but that hasn't worked either. Because if the West thought this was all the Houthis had, they were sorely mistaken. Right, so with so many other things going on, it's been a while since I covered the goings-on in the Red Sea and the Houthi responses to having been bombed by the US and UK in response to their actions against commercial shipping headed to or from Israel. There had been no fatalities whatsoever caused by the Houthi drone strikes and their speedboat harassment. They'd created a whole new form of naval blockade, the first time in history that such a blockade had been achieved without the need for a very expensive to maintain navy. Such is the advantage the Houthis have in terms of geography, being able to cause chaos at the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Red Sea itself none too wide itself either, and nor indeed is the Gulf of Aden leading into the strait. That's a lot of Yemeni coastline to get past for anyone wanting to access the Suez Canal, the shortcut for some 12% of global trade. The excuse was made. The Houthis are attacking all shipping, except they weren't, just that destined for and leaving from Israel. Still now there are stories about a ship from this country or that country getting struck by Houthi attacks. But it is not where the ship is registered that counts. It is whether it is bound for Israel or not, and thanks to our involvement in trying to stop the Houthis by force, instead of doing the right, just, and frankly as now can be seen far easier option of just stopping Israel committing genocide. As soon as Israel stop attacking Gaza, Yemen will stop attacking shipping. It's all that simple. Stopping them by force has not worked. Killing Houthis, the first people to actually die in all of this blockade business of Israeli shipping, hasn't stopped them either. They aren't wired up that way. They're quite prepared to die for the cause. And it is costing us and the US a bloody fortune shooting down cheap drones with very expensive missiles, and of course the knock-on economic effect from our goods having to be diverted all the way around Africa now. But if the West thought the Houthis were at the limits of their abilities and their armaments, funded by Iran as they are, the media does like to remind us of that, don't forget, then we were sorely wrong. On Saturday past, for example, the Houthis deployed for the first time a submarine drone. Now these are a bit dearer than the ones they've been playing with so far that fly around in the air, and were developed by Iran, so if Iran backing them still comes as a surprise to you, no matter how many times on the news these rebels get introduced as Iran-backed Houthis, it should be beyond doubt by now. I'm still waiting for them to address the Israeli Defense Forces US-backed, though. Anyway, it's a new toy in their arsenal. They aren't dissimilar to torpedoes apparently, except they travel more slowly, although do have longer range. And although it got picked up and destroyed, along with a drone boat and 3 anti-ship cruise missiles, it shows the Houthis are upping their game, are not backing down, and are never likely to, because they simply don't quit, and Iran will keep supplying them for as long as necessary, and no matter how many headcase US politicians want to bomb Iran, even Genocide Joe, surely, isn't that stupid. Not even for Israel's sake. I am perfectly prepared to be ridiculed and proven wrong on that, of course. Anyway, now these missiles the Houthis are firing are a bit of a step up in the expense department from the drones they were using before. There are missiles coming in at around $10,000 each. However, shipping isn't necessarily their only targets, since the US have been deploying their Reaper drones off the coast of Yemen. They've been using their MQ-9 Reapers, long-distance, large drones capable of missile deployment in and of their own right, and they've been going around in the area and up and down the Yemeni coastline. And last Sunday, the Houthis reported they'd shot one down. So they'd spent one of their $10,000 missiles used to bring down a drone, which is worth $30 million. And that was the second one the Houthis had brought down, apparently. This is where they are winning most of all, because the cost to those taking a stand for Gaza against Israel and those aiding and abetting them is peanuts compared to the cost not just in military hardware but trade as well. Back to the shipping we go though, because in the last few days the Houthis have not only brought down that Reaper drone, but they've taken out 3 cargo vessels as well, belonging to the UK and the US. All our attacks have served is to make ourselves targets too. On Saturday, the British-registered Belize-flagged cargo ship Ruby Mar hadn't even made it as far as the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, having left Saudi Arabia and destined for Bulgaria, and planning to take the Suez Canal as their chosen path. But they were approaching the strait through the Gulf of Aden when they got hit by Houthi missiles. According to the Houthi military spokesperson, Yahya Sari, in a televised address on the attack yesterday, he said the Ruby Mar had suffered catastrophic damages and came to a complete halt. As a result of the extensive damage the ship suffered, it is now at risk of potential sinking in the Gulf of Aden. During the operation, we made sure that the ship's crew exited safe. There are claims going around that the ship has now sunk, though this, at the time of writing, is still to be confirmed. What our government in the UK have confirmed is that the crew were indeed rescued, and that the ship was taking on water, so it may well be true that this will be the first Houthi sinking of a vessel so far. Karma says it had to be a UK vessel though, really, didn't it? It wasn't the only ship attacked, though. The day after the Rumi Bar attack, the US-owned Greece-flagged cargo ship Sea Champion was hit. Now, they'd left Rosario in Argentina and were actually bound for Aden in Yemen. They were on their way to Yemen. Later that same day, another US vessel, the Marshall Island-flagged Navis Fortuna, was also struck by missiles, having left Enore in India, bound for Ravenna in Italy. Fundamentally, all the US and UK have done by increasing their strikes on Yemeni targets, whatever they are not working. Saudi Arabia pounded the Houthis for 8 years, poor as they are, before they were forced to give up. The US and UK will have no more effect on them than Saudi Arabia did. Instead, the Houthis have brought bigger weapons to bear now, have upped the ante, and while still seeking to preserve life, as shown by their rescue of the crew of the Ruby Mar, undermining narratives that they are just mad and bad rebels, while exposing the West for being as indifferent to Yemeni lives as they appear to be of Gazan ones, they won't back down, they won't stop. And the longer the US and UK insist on these attacks, the more embarrassing it's going to get, as their failures will keep getting exposed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, especially in terms of who is a terrorist and who isn't, it was less than a month ago that Yemen declared the US and UK as terrorist states, and given their conduct in the Middle East, well, for a lot of us, we wouldn't go out of our way to necessarily argue against that, would we? Look at it from their point of view, for heaven's sake. You can get the details of this story on this video recommendation next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the United Nations have issued a press release which makes for rather interesting reading on the matter of arms exports to Israel. Of course, we know from the International Court of Justice case that South Africa brought against Israel that there is now a plausible case for genocide having been demonstrated. Still to be judged on the merits of their case, of course, but given the interim orders handed down by the ICJ on Israel back on January 26th, and given that Israel have not followed any of them, indeed they have arrogantly boasted that they will take no notice of them, it is pretty clear that they are violating international law and don't care who calls it out, because they'll just turn around to their accusers and infer they are terrorist sympathisers and anti-Semites, because it is what they always do. So the UN, which the ICJ is of course a branch of, have issued a statement that every country still supplying arms to Israel really needs to sit up and take notice of. Right, so Israel and those provisional orders that the International Court of Justice laid down last month. Israel said they'd ignore them, and it seems they very much have. Israel have until Monday to report to the ICJ on what they've done to meet the terms of this legal ruling, and well, it doesn't look like they're going to be too bothered to send anything in. The dog ate our homework. Is that going to be their excuse? But it isn't so much what Israel are not doing right now that is at the crux of this new United Nations statement, but those aiding and abetting them instead. Those providing Israel with weaponry and military aid, because this statement is a none too subtle shot across their bows to reconsider what they are doing. This statement has come from the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which has basically demanded arms sales to Israel stop immediately. The UN telling all nations selling arms to Israel cease with immediate effect. Here's part of what it says. Any transfer of weapons or ammunition to Israel that would be used in Gaza is likely to violate international humanitarian law and must cease immediately, UN experts warned today. All states must ensure respect for international humanitarian law by parties to an armed conflict, as required by 1949 Geneva Conventions and customary international law, the experts said. States must accordingly refrain from transferring any weapon or ammunition or parts for them if it is expected, given the facts or past patterns of behaviour, that they would be used to violate international law. Such transfers are prohibited even if the exporting state does not intend the arms to be used in violation of the law, or does not know with certainty that they would be used in such a way, as long as there is a clear risk, they said. Over 29,313 Palestinians have been killed and 69,333 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023, the majority being women and children. Israel has repeatedly failed to comply with international law, the experts said. The experts noted that states parties to the Arms Trade Treaty have additional treaty obligations to deny arms exports if they know that the arms would be used to commit international crimes, or if there is an overriding risk that the arms transferred could be used to commit serious violations of international humanitarian law. European Union member states are further bound by EU arms export control law. The need for an arms embargo on Israel is heightened by the International Court of Justice's ruling on the 26th of January 2024 that there is a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza and the continuing serious harms to civilians since then, the experts said. The Genocide Convention of 1948 requires states parties to employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent genocide in another state as far as possible. This necessitates halting arms exports in the present circumstances, the experts said. The experts welcomed the suspension of arms transfers to Israel by Belgium, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and the Japanese company Itochu Corporation. The European Union also recently discouraged arms exports to Israel. The experts urged other states to immediately halt arms transfers to Israel, including export licenses and military aid. The United States and Germany are by far the largest arms exporters, and shipments have increased since 7th of October 2023. Other military exporters include France, the United Kingdom, Canada and Australia. State officials involved in arms exports may be individually criminally liable for aiding and abetting any war crimes, crimes against humanity or acts of genocide, the experts said. All states under the principle of universal jurisdiction and the International Criminal Court may be able to investigate and prosecute such crimes. Arms companies contributing to the production and transfer of arms to Israel and businesses investing in those companies bear their own responsibility to respect human rights, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. They have not publicly demonstrated the heightened human rights due diligence required of them and accordingly risk complicity in violations, the experts said. International law does not enforce itself, the experts said. All states must not be complicit in international crimes through arms transfers. They must do their part to urgently end the unrelenting humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. A lot of experts saying a lot of things in that statement, you will have noticed. These are all listed at the bottom of the statement itself, if you care to look on the UN's own website. They comprise many of the UN special rapporteurs relating to various aspects of law and human rights, as well as some others so from other areas of expertise. In effect, though, any supply of arms to Israel is in violation of international law, purely based on the possibility that such arms could be used against Gaza. Of course, Israel are also bombing Syria and Lebanon right now as well, but that simply shows how much they care about peace in the region, frankly. Zionism in Gaza and elsewhere is how it ought to be described, to be honest, and how nations aforementioned who are still doing so are enabling the continued Zionism in Palestine, or of Palestine and beyond. The occupation, the invasion, the genocide, and the political movement behind that is Zionism. Israel can have its right to defend itself, but not at the expense of enacting Zionism in Gaza. Phraseology is one thing, though. It's not the crux of this statement, because what is that if you're supplying weapons to Israel, no matter whether they use them in Gaza or not, is against humanitarian law, against the Geneva Conventions. All those nations are signatories to. This extends to whether you know they are being used or not, but if you do know, then you're violating the arms treaties too. And of course, any investigation, any court case made against you then, as a supplier of arms to Israel, we can use the UK as an example. Both South Africa and Nicaragua are already taking us to the ICJ for aiding and abetting Israel. Cases to be heard in due course. But ultimately, this means arms supplies to Israel, no matter who it is, no matter what treaty they may be signatories of, must cease with immediate effect. And anyone carrying on, and anybody involved in that, and anybody connected to that, financing that, will likely expect a day in the dock in future as well. This is one of the most sharply defined calls for cessation of weapon sales to Israel we've yet seen, because there is clear risk they will be used in Gaza against civilian infrastructure and targets. As Palestine Permanent Advisor to the UN Riyad Mansour said the other day at the ICJ, whilst 55 countries have been giving further evidence of the Zionism of Palestine, the decades of occupation there, on Israel's relationship with international law, he said, they defy the law and the law is barely fighting back. Never a truer word said. For as much as our leaders right now this week are falling over themselves to blame Muslims and make Islamophobic slurs about Islamist terrorism aimed at MPs, this is what really should be being thrown at them, because they are barely fighting back against the oppressors. They're aiding them instead. They're doing so by continuing to supply arms to them and supplying political cover for them, and they need someone else to deflect public discontent onto to take the heat off themselves. So they're weaponising another form of racism as saying to people, get angry at those people instead. Get angry at those in the street marching for an end to the genocide, an end to the occupation, and a free and independent Palestinian state being set up. And we've got to stop falling for it. This UN statement is in stark contrast to Tory or Labour narratives now, for a reason. Because we have the worst leaders possible, and the UN is obviously right here. Instead of listening to our leaders, these prat-faced politicians that somehow keep wheedling themselves into power, we can expect further clampdowns on our freedom of expression, our rights to protest, from whoever is in government, whichever one of these horrible bunch it is. So honestly, I don't think a day in The Hague for the likes of Sunak or Starmer can come fast enough, because they're not going to shift. Arms sales from the UK to Israel should stop and must stop immediately. We need leaders that are actually going to do it, though. It shouldn't just be down to protesters forcing this narrative. We're trying to force change, forcing these factories to shut for a day here or a day there. It has to end as part of a boycott on Israel, as most of this country has clearly expressed in multiple polls that it wants. I can see such protests outside the likes of Elbit or whoever increasing. Heck, last month we saw 4 factories supplying the Netanyahu regime all get shut down on one day as a clear show of public anger over this. Over our leaders' failures to uphold international law, our obligations under international treaties. And you can find out all about that stellar display of people power here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.